Firstly, I'm a little uncomfortable beginning Kinnos Tavshin Pei Vav in front of a few esteemed Talmidei Chachamim, that many of them are more capable than me. Some of them are well-known Marbitzei Torah, as well as there are people here that are people who are tremendous Talmidei Chachamim that work leparnasasam, that are nistarim, and I only come up to their ankles. Some who are Talmidim who have far surpassed me, so maybe as a Talmud they come, but again, I feel unworthy in front of quite a few people here. Also, a thank you to my son-in-law, Reb Aryeh, and Mayor Summers and Rob Shore for what they do to spread Torah throughout Klal Yisrael. And thank you to all the Gaboyim and all those who work so hard to make Mevakshei Emes a place of Torah, Tefillah, and Chesed. The Nesivos HaMishpat has a commentary to Eicha, a commentary called Palgei Mayim, and he explains his approach to Eicha and by extension to Kinnos in the following way. I'll read L'Shonei HaKadosh. Matoi eles l'sipurim hayoganot. Of what purpose are these painful stories? Omnam im yisaper loy sipos hatzaroi she'ira loy leman yishmar be'atzmoi mahasibois hamevios lidei hatzaros. But if we read all of Megillas Eicha, and by extension the Kinnos, as alluding to reasons for the Churban, L'chein ra'isi lefarish mazkir hatzara mazkir hachet. The Nesivos in his Perush Palgei Mayim writes that all of the psukim could be described as not simply describing the tzara, but alluding to the chet that lies behind the tzara. It's a beautiful Perush. Every single pasuk Nesivos describes as not just simply describing the tzara, but describing the tzara which behind it is alluding to the chet itself. And the Nesivos pulls it out, pasuk after pasuk. This applies how we look at the stories of the Churban. They're not just painful stories or even inspiring stories, qua stories. The goal is to create a change or to inspire greater heights in Avodas Hashem. My son Menachem reminded me that many years ago, Rav Tzvi Shaloni shared a very poignant point here in the Beis Medrash about Nevuzudran Rav HaTabachim. Chazal expound on the fact that Nevuzudran, Titus's general, is described as the butcher. He tortured us. Throughout the history, there have been those who have butchered Klal Yisrael. Klaus Barbie was known, the Nazi was known as the butcher of Lyon, France. And Rav Tzvi asked the following question. Rav Tzvi asked, why is it that our enemies are not simply satisfied with exterminating us? Why is it that there is almost an obsession to torture us as well? B'machshakim tivka nafshi. It wasn't just that the hostages were held in absolute darkness. The psychological torture, the physical torture, that was part of attacking Klal Yisrael. They wanted to send back those tortured souls that would not be killed to torture us. Rav Tzvi explained that to simply exterminate is not to destroy Klal Yisrael. In a desperate attempt to try to defy HaKadosh Baruch Hu's reality of Netzach Yisrael, Lo Yishaker, our enemies do everything they can, anything they could sink to torture us, with the hope that somehow we'll be broken. So the stories, when we hear them, when we read them, and when we think about them, those stories are there not just to connect to the Avelus, and we're going to prove it halachically in a couple of minutes, but the stories are there in order to inspire us. In this case, it's to inspire us. Netzach Yisrael is not mishaker. That Klal Yisrael goes on for eternity, despite what all of our enemies have tried to do to us. And this answers a few basic questions as we introduce the Kinnos. The Rambam writes in Hilchos Avelus, Perik Yud Gimel, Halacha Yud and Yud Aleph, that an individual is not allowed to be misabel yoser midai. It's prohibited for us to live in a place of Avelus for too long. We have to pick ourselves up from the Petira of Rabbi Yonatan Cohen. We have to pick up ourselves up from the Petira of Simcha Lauer. We have to pick ourselves up from the Petira of Rabbi Yosef Newman. They don't want us to be misabel yoser midai. And the Rambam in Halacha doesn't want us to. But yet, when it comes to Avelus HaChurban, there are no limits. Kol misabel yoiser v'yoiser zoiche v'royeh. V'kol she'eino misabel. Rabbi points out to me, Rav Asher Weiss always emphasized, it doesn't say that he didn't build it in his days. Kilu hichriv biyamav. It's not that we didn't build the Beis HaMikdash. We've destroyed it in our days. And the Avelus doesn't stop. And there are no limits. Why is that? What's the Emek HaDavar? Question number one. Question number two, there are many, many Mekairis in the Gemara and the Rishonim that when it comes to the Su'udah Mafsekes, the din of the Su'udah Mafsekes has the din of Kemesoi Muta Lefanav. Yet we know that Lo Aleinu, when it comes to an Einain doesn't make a bracha, he doesn't bench. The G'dolei Achrayim ask, if it's true, and it is true, that the Su'udah Mafsekes has the din of Mesoi Muta Lefanav and has the din of Aninus, so then why is it that we're chayiv in mitzvahs? Question number two. So question number one, the basic question of why does Avelus for a Yachid have a limit? Yet Misabel al Yerushalayim has no limit. Question number two, when it comes to Su'udah Mafsekes, there on the one hand, it's a Su'udah of Aninus, yet we're chayiv in mitzvahs. This is a greater Avelus, as we see from the prior point. Yet, nevertheless, we're still chayiv in mitzvahs. Question number three, the psukim seem to contradict themselves in regards to nechamas Am Yisrael. Aniya Sarah loy nechama. There is no nechama. Yet, at the same time, the pasuk says, Nachamu, Nachamu, Ami. Is there nechama or is there not nechama until Binyan Beis Hamikdash Hashlishi? For loss, there are two parts of nechama. There's accepting the gzar din, baruch deine Emes, and adjusting to a new reality. And then there's another nechama, and that's the nechama of finding comfort by improving on the past. A yachid has the responsibility at a certain point to accept the gzar din and adjust to a new reality. But we are never, as a tzibur, supposed to reach a point and adjust to a reality without a Beis Hamikdash. The only nechama that we have is to find comfort by improving ourselves, because we know one day we will return to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and one day the Beis Hamikdash will be rebuilt. We are not supposed to make peace with Churban Abayis in any way or shape or form. Ani asara loy nuchama. We will never fully be comforted until the chol gvulecha lavnei chafetz. When is there nechama? What nechama is there? Dabru Yerushalayim v'kiru eleha. That when we come close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu through our pain, through our suffering, then for that, on that bechina, there is nechama. But that's it. But never, ever to adjust to this reality. Never to adjust to this amazing Shivas Tzion, where everything at peacetime, if we could call such any time here peacetime, but at peacetime, that everything seems so amazing that if our grandparents, our great-great-grandparents would be here, they would say, we're living in Mashiach Tzaitin. And I've heard people use this expression, that we're in a state of Geula already. We can't say that. We can't make peace until HaKadosh Baruch Hu has his home. We can't make peace until we could fully encounter HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which we still cannot. And we're not allowed to accept this reality. Zok the Heilige Teisves. What's the reason why an Oinein, the halacha is, he's potter from mitzvahs? Quotes a Yerushalmi. There are two reasons about it. We're going to quote one of them. Tais quotes the pasuk, L'man tiskar, kol yimei chayecha, yomim shata oisek b'chayim, v'lo yomim shata oisek b'meisim. That when an individual is in a place of life, then he's connected to Torah and mitzvahs. When a person is in a place of death, so then he's potter from mitzvahs. The Su'uda HaMafsekes, we're not supposed to be Osek B'Mesim. In Kinnos and in Eicha, we're not supposed to be Osek B'Mesim. We're supposed to be Osek B'Chaim. An Onein is Osek B'Mesim, and then the Rambam says he must move past that place. He must move past that place. He must be in the place of the Chaim, eventually. As the halacha beautifully dictates the process of Avelos. When it comes to Korban Abayis, on the one hand, we're entirely paralyzed. We are entirely unable to accept the situation that we're in, and we demand HaKadosh Baruch Hu change that reality, and we beg of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to change that reality, and we cry over all the pain of the past. But Zakta Nesivis, everything in Eicha that's written over there is not the description of Hamesim. It's not a description simply of torture and pain, but rather every single part of it is to bring us to a place of tshuva. We are not incomplete and paralyzed, we are incomplete and building towards something that's better. So that's our avoda for Tisha B'Av. Our avoda for Tisha B'Av is for us to take all of these painful kinnos and turn them into his askus b'chaim. To take the pain of these painful kinnos and to turn it into tshuva. I daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that you and I make the most of this Tisha B'Av. That we set aside time, that what we read, that what we listen to, and that what we think about turns into an act of tshuva. That we're zoche through it to build the Beis HaMikdash. Let's begin Kinnos Vav. I'll just say a couple things before we start reading inside. The Kinna begins Shavas. Everything came to a standstill. Rav Soloveitchik has a very, very powerful description on page 198. The page pagination I will give you in the Kinnos will follow along in the art scroll. It starts on page 152. When I read from the Kinnos of Rav Soloveitchik's, I'll tell you where the page is. It's on page 198. And Rav Soloveitchik explains the word Shavas in a very, very important way. Let's take a look. For those who have it, I'll try to read it slowly. For those who have it, could read along with me. On the bottom of 198. Sometimes people realize intuitively or intellectually that a disaster will occur. As a result, when the disaster does occur, it is not experienced as something new, but as something that was expected. At other times, however, disaster strikes suddenly, and this sudden disaster is emotionally and psychologically more devastating than an anticipated disaster. Given this aspect of human nature, Rabbi Eliezer HaKalir is expressing the thought that the major tragedy of the Churban was not that it occurred over time, but Shavas. It occurred suddenly. In other words, what Rav Soloveitchik is describing is that the Churban happened in a very sudden way. There was a silence, an abrupt silence. I mention to the Chevra all the time that Reb David Feinstein describes that he was in Gur in 1938. In Gur in 1938, there were 30 or 40,000 Hasidim by the Imrei Emes, Zechusa Yagan Aleinu. Reb David then was a small child. He was zoche to go into the Rebbe. The Rebbe gave him a bracha, and he said as he was running away from the Nazis, and as he was in Siberia, he felt the Rebbe's bracha with him at every moment. But 1939 in Gur, it was absolutely quiet. There was no one there. And it wasn't the first time this happened in Jewish history. Soloveitchik describes, continuing on page 198, he describes that Chazal allude to this in Tur Malka. The theme of Shavas, the sudden and unexpected occurrence of destruction, is also reflected in the story recounted by Chazal in the city of Tur Malka in the Gemara Gittin on Daf Nun Zayin. Half of the inhabitants of Turmalka were celebrating, while the other half were already in the midst of destruction. Pachad pechadim. And I think of a silence in Netiv HaSarah, in the Gaza envelope. It's a morning at 5:30 and everything is absolutely quiet. And as the Hamas butchers enter the kibbutz, I saw a picture of Gil Ta'asa. From the silence of that morning, there's a picture of him in his shorts, holding his son in his shorts at 7 in the morning, running under a hail of bullets. His son Or was killed and Gil jumped on a grenade to save the children that were next to him. And we still have kibbutzim in the year Tafshin Pei Vav, in the year 2026, that sit in total silence. Shav asuri meni shimuni oivrai, schiumos hayesimuni bedrei chaveirai. Sakois mishkan maschois tevirai, sakois vivon. Sakois vivon, saftu chaf moda yavarai, ksula chavirai. Noflo ideinu betzul dechuyo. Einichik salach hazoin ben berachio. Also v'nicham Al pnei fros nuptzu chasideha. Al gesuv zochru kolu yisoideha. Pachad cheid shiloi tochav soideha. Patsu ma'aseho yol v'nideha. Pershot tzion biyodeha. Al hartzion sadu shoynei medonai. Safu al roshei tzion zidoinai. Samsu b'noi lamoid doinai. Tzoid notzar teloi rer midonai. Sa'akami b'mei. Tzadiku adonai. Atokavim Karos liyoshvei givoinoid heim zermuni. Koili lahashmiya. Parov higmuni. Kumi avoiri bosel herimuni. Karosi lemavai heimori. Lama ruach apeinu latevan shemuriz. Yisok yomol v'chas b'yot amoru. Rafta b'yad yecheskel in koin k'moimoru. Ruv nachidei migoy amoru. Adonai kitzadi me'aycha amoru. Shiveni sisi shimale goy. Shivtom rebois chatzer eladki. Sosei mishoyrei devir dahaladi. Shamatas mores afech metatei shalom. Tir teufel tzavay. Tzavay kol rasam panecho. Tzavay el tzar asher k'monu. Voy. Before we complete Kinavav, I'd like to point out to you that on the bottom of 152 in the art scroll Kinnos, we said exactly the point that the Nesivus builds his whole perush. Al pnei fros nuptzu chasidea, on the surface of the Euphrates, her pious ones were mutilated. The art scroll here quotes the Medrash that when Nebuchadnezzar saw the renowned Leviim who once sang in the Beis Hamikdash, he demanded they serenade him as he feasted merrily over his victory. And of course, the Leviim mutilated their fingers. That's the reference over here, Al Pnei Fros Nuptzu Chasideha. But notice the next line. Palge Suf Zachra Ka'oru Yisodeha. Yet she remembered the splitting of the sea of the Yam Suf, even while her foundation was being destroyed. The goal of reflecting all this pain is for us to come closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in our personal avoda. And it started already with our Bubas and Zaydos, that when they were being tortured, they remembered HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Palge Suf Zachra Ka'aru Yisodeh. They remembered their closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and they realized that just like HaKadosh Baruch Hu had sent a tremendous miracle at Yam Suf, this is also a tremendous miracle. In what way? Our suffering is Lamala Me'ateva. Our survival is Lamala Me'ateva, and our suffering is Lamala Me'ateva. And when we suffer, we're supposed to remember that it is a particular message from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and it comes from the chavivus of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. As many have pointed out, that a father loves a child when the child is doing well and when the child rewards the child. But if chas v'chali, what happens if the child is sick? Writes the Nesiv Shalom. And the father is a doctor. And the father has to operate on the child. There's a tremendous love of that father when he needs to cut the child. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu loves us, and therefore says in the Nesiv Shalom, at the time of pain, the Kruvim, at the time of destruction, were hugging each other. Kol roidev kahi sigua bein hamitzarim. It's a time of tremendous opportunity of closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu when HaKadosh Baruch Hu cuts us. Kinnos Zayin. Kinnos Zayin begin with the Kinnos that are referred to as the Eicha Kinnos. The Medrash points out that the word Eicha is used in different ways. The Medrash says, Moshe Rabbeinu said, Eicha esa levadi tarchachem u'masachem. Yeshayahu said, Eicha haisa lezayna. Yirmiyahu said, Eicha yashva bidad. Focusing on the last two, Yeshayahu describes Eicha as how could Klal Yisrael become so perverse. Yirmiyahu says Eicha Yashva Bidad, the last. Look at the desolation. But Rav Soloveitchik Zatzal understood that these Kinnos are not an expression of alas, but really questioning HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We are allowed and we are supposed to question HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The structure of Sefer Eicha is built that way as well. The Pasuk in Yirmiyahu says that Eicha wrote a Megillah and that added Dvarim Harbe. And the Medrash seems to understand that refers to Perek Aleph and Perek Beis of Eicha. And then we go to Perek Gimel. That is reflected in the structure of Eicha. The first two prakim, Aleph and Beis, are written with the Seder of the Aleph Beis. One Aleph followed by a Beis and then followed by a Gimel. Yet Perek Gimel of Eicha has 3 alephes with 3 bases and 3 gimels. And that different structure to the Megillah reflects, and if you look at the psukim are questioning HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Eicha Perek Beis, Eicha Yov Ba'apo, which is exactly how we begin Kinnos Zayin, Eicha Atzta V'Apecha. The Kinnos are modeling the Megillah itself, a questioning of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. How could it be? We even question HaKadosh Baruch Hu, what about his promises? Perek Gimel has a different sound to it entirely. There are parts of it that are amazing that someone in suffering could say. Chazdei Hashem ki lo samnu ki lo cholu rachamav. That pasuk is mind-boggling. But even psukim that are not as mind-boggling. The theme of Perek Gimel, nach b'sad rachenu v'nach koira v'noshuva ad Hashem. The process is questioning and then tziduk hadin. And then accepting HaKadosh Baruch Hu's din. Right now, we're at the stage of questioning HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Eicha atzta v'apecha. We allude to this also at the end, a very interesting expression that's used at the end of Kinnos Zayin, Raganti. Raganti, I have complained. It's the same Lashon Vateirognu v'alechem that we had in Sefer Dvarim, that we complained. There we're talking about Klal Yisrael in the Midbar complaining. Almost an unproductive form of complaining. Raganti. Maybe we could add that it's not just simply complaining. In the sense that if it's used in the right direction, then at times a person, and particularly on Tisha B'Av, is allowed to cry out to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and question HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And it's a necessary step to his skarvus to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And there are many ways to be masbir this, but I'd like to explain it in a way that we've mentioned in the past, and one of the most powerful stories that I encountered in my own personal life. When I was a child, I had the schus that my children didn't have, that your children don't have. And it actually is something that weighs on me tremendously because it's something that I can't give my children and my grandchildren. When I rolled out of bed into shul in the morning, my father, Olav Hashem, was already there way before davening. My father was one of the few that didn't have a tattoo on his arm. I was zocha as a child to grow up around Holocaust survivors. And I would see them put their tefillin on their tattoos. They would roll up their arms. That's something that's indescribable. One of those men was Rav Asher Anshel Tessler. His son Rav Yaakov is a close Talmudan friend. Rav Asher Anshel was a strong man. There were men and women that the Holocaust had broken. Rav Asher Anshel was not broken by the Holocaust. His parents were killed at Kiddush Hashem. His siblings were killed at Kiddush Hashem. But it seemed like it made him even stronger. Sometimes I would daven. I grew up in Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn, but sometimes I would daven in Frankel's in Flatbush. And Rav Asher Anshel davened there during the week. He lived in Sheepshead Bay. He davened with us on Shabbos, but during the week he davened there. And he was one of the mainstays of the early Daf Yomi. And he was one of those Jews that would walk around. Frankel's is a minion factory. He would walk around with the tzedakah box after every minion. I would come in for the 8:30, 8:45, 9 o'clock. What's with us? Mevakshei Emes doesn't have one yet. We haven't made it yet until you have a 9 o'clock minyan. So I would come in to late minyan as a teenager, and Rabbi Asher Anshel would knip me on the cheek, and he would say, "Chaim, you're late." Say, I've been here since 6 in the morning. I davened at the 6:15 minyan, did the Daf Yomi 7. I'm on the 4th round with my pushka. In my mind, Rabbi Asher Anshel was the paradigm of someone who represented consistency in Avodas Hashem, strength through pushing through it all. Years later, when I was a Rebbe in the Old City in the Tivarye, Rabbi Yaakov called me up that his grandfather was in Eretz Yisrael. He used to love to come to the Mekom HaKadoshim. He felt very close to Ira Avos Chevron. He was coming straight from Chevron to the Old City. And it turned out, I did not know this, that Rabbi Asher Anshel did not speak about his experiences in the Holocaust. Somehow I convinced him to speak to the second-year boys in the Tivarye, and Rabbi Yaakov told me after that day, the stories began to pour out. This story he did not say in the Tivarye, but Rabbi Yaakov told me afterwards that after the war, the Joint had arranged for support for the Jews in the DP camps. And Rabbi Asher Anshel received money to be able to find lodgings and food. He was mamish alone. And they gave him a pair of tefillin. He said 2 months, after he received that, he woke up one morning and he realized that he was really angry at HaKadosh Baruch Hu. For 2 months, he just did it because his father had bought him a pair of tefillin. He got another pair of tefillin. And then he realized he's really angry at HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So he said he decided that morning he's not davening. He's not putting on tefillin, he's not davening. He went for a walk. At 10 o'clock in the morning, he started getting hungry. And then he remembered the voice of his holy mother. His mother had said, Asher Anshel me'es nicht far davening. We don't eat before davening. So now he couldn't eat, but he didn't want to daven. He bought a newspaper. He read the newspaper and he just got hungrier. He didn't want to daven, but he's getting hungry. And he told his son, Rabbi Yaakov, he ran back to his room. And he threw on his tefillin and he screamed at God. Roganti. Va'ato ader chog hashemayim. Rav Soloveitchik said on Yom Kippur, at these moments, where we're sitting in the Kinnos of Perek Aleph and Perek Beis of Eicha, we're allowed to scream out HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And there are Yechidim here, and we as a tzibur in Eretz Yisrael, who can cry out to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and say, why? Lama. After Roganti, Adar Chug HaShemayim. Of course, the hero in this story is Rabbi Asher Anshel's mother, the Kedosha. And that starts from Moshe Rabbeinu and Torah Tziva Lanu Moshe Meirasha Kilas Yaakov. And the beauty of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's system of halacha, that every detail of halacha forms and forges Klal Yisrael. And if we have the siyata d'shmaya, and if we have the fortitude to give over to our children that bechina of the Daled Chelkei Shulchan Aruch of halacha, then that's what maintains us. That's what propels us. And that allows for a system We're Raganti, where a person asks Lama and then can move to the next step. And the next step is Lama. One more point before we get to the Lama and the next Kina. There's a very powerful Gemara in Shuas on the word Raganti. Vateragnu v'ahalechem, the Gemara in Shuas on Daf Mem Zayin Amebez understands the pasuk in a different way from the pasuk pshat. The pasuk pshat is Vateragnu v'ahalechem is that you complained, v'alechem, you complained by your tents. But the Gemara says Vateragnu, that you spoke Lashon Hara ba'alechem on your Oel, on Oel Shel Olam, the tent of the world. And what's that tent? That you spoke Lashon Hara about Eretz Yisrael. It's amazing. Gemara in Shavuos Mem Zayin Amud Beis describes HaKadosh Baruch Hu's providence over Klal Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael as an Oel, mamish, an iron dome. Vateragnu va'alechem. You spoke Lashon Hara about Eretz Yisrael. Rabbosai, HaKadosh Baruch Hu has given us a massive opportunity that for many of us, it's been Bayis Sheni, and some of us maybe even Bayis Rishon, since our ancestors have been here. We're talking about close to 2,000 years, if not more. That means we're talking about hundreds of ancestors that have davened 3 times a day with Yishlayim Yircha Barachamim Tashuv, Esemach David. And we're finally here. And they weren't Zocha. And we are much smaller than them. And we're going to speak Lashon Hara about Eretz Yisrael? It's Rav Sanidra. My Rabbi Rav Nevin Sal Shlit, and I must say, I'm not always Mekayim it, and I'm Toveya myself, says that even when a person says that it's Had in Beit Shemesh, that's a Shaila Vateragnu v'alechem. We have many, many questions about our manhigim. Baruch Hashem, we have different people from different communities, and that's the beauty of Mevakshei Emes. I'll talk about this a little bit later. And even within our own communities, we don't understand our manhigim. I'm not talking about someone else's manhig, even one's own manhig. Just as awesome it is to be here in Eretz Yisrael at this time, it is also the most overwhelming position to be in, to be a manig in Eretz Yisrael at this time as well. And I'm talking about going from the prime minister all the way down. The confusion of Ikvisa de Mashiach, the confusion of Aschalta de Geula, and Chazal speak about it. There's no chidushim here. And the confusion every single one of us have about how to do Yishuv Eretz Yisrael properly is not matir Lashon Hara. Vateragnu v'alechem. A Yid has kashas. There are many, many kashas. That's the point that we're at. Raganti. But not vateragnu v'alechem. Kadosh Baruch Hu says, scream to me. Don't scream to each other about everybody else's chesronos. Scream at me. Throw it at me. Throw it back at HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but don't throw it back at another Jew. Kadosh Baruch Hu can handle it. Us, fragile people, the fragile Klal Yisrael with its fragile manhigim, one day will be zocha that the manhigim will not be fragile anymore. One day we won't be fragile, and one day our manhigim won't be fragile. One day we'll be zocha b'siyata d'shmaya that will go to Beis Hamikdash. We'll see a Kohen Gadol. B'meira v'yameinu. We'll go to Lishkas HaGozis, and there will be Mechamta Shel Torah, and then Yotza Halacha B'Berura in all parts about the country, about its safety, about Halacha, Avodas Beis Hamikdash, Avodas HaTorah, Avodas HaTfilah, Avodas HaChesed. But we're still in Galus. And with Galus comes a tremendous fragility. And in that state of fragility, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, throw it back to me, but don't destroy yourselves. וכן ביתינו זכר אדוני מהויבנו. איך גרת בגר וסגל גויס ביד גאים גאולך וסגרת לגס אשר דלגת לדגולך. וכן דיבר זכר אדוני מהויבנו. איך גרת בגר וסגל גויס ביד גאים גאולך וסגרת לגס לדגולך אשר דלגת לדגולך. וכן דיברנו זכר אדוני מהויבנו. איך הגת בהגיונך לאדוני בידו למענך וזכרת להיות וסק וסס שביעת לזבודך וכן וקויננו זכר אדוני מהויבנו. איך זנחת בזמך לזלזל ביד זורם זבולך לא זכרת חיתום ככבר ואשר הרגת לך מולך. וכן חייבינו זכר אדוני מהויבנו. איך טרחת בתורכך לטרוף ביד טורפים תלויך ולא זכרתי עיקר קידוס יושר שהכנת ליודך. וכן ילנו זכר אדוני כמנת בחסך לך לא יסביעת כפירים כרמך. זכרת לא לזנויח לא אלו מה שלימדת לוכלך והילגנו זכר אדוני ילנו. איכו מילאת במועסל וכל יסביעת בנים מן הסך לא זכרת נשיאה. וזכרת אוי זעדי אדוני אשר התרת לעבודך וכן אני אזכור אדוני מהויבנו. פצת בחדך לפגר ביד פריצים כליך וזכרת את צלת צבי צדיק אשר צבעת לצבאך וכן זכר אדוני מהויבנו. וכוס מקריאס לקריס ביעקב מקרוך וזכרת רגש ובסיים אשר רציס לריח וגענו. זכר אדוני מהויבנו. איכו שאפת בשאפך לשלויס ביד שודדים שלמך. וזכרת תוקף טלטלי סויר אשר תיקנת סמימך וכן תענו זכר אדוני מהויבנו. תעננו לשפוך דמעויס כמים. אמן. אמן ביום זה נשפינו פעמיים. זכרי ביוסי בשלווה יושבס בירושלים. רוגנתי ועתו עד חוג השמיים. Continuing on in Kinnos, עד חוג השמיים. In some ways, this Kinnos might be the most depressing of all the Kinnos. Kinnos. On page 164 in the Art Scroll edition, it reaches a point of depression. About 5 or 6 lines from the top, Eta ehole apadni b'tzal maves, atusa ve'eshkoina ad chatzar maves. I would pitch my palatial tents, in other words, what was once my tents of palace, in the death's courtyards. Atusa, I would travel ve'eshkona and dwell at chatzar maves, in the place of death, a courtyard. Etafel et hamichakim lamaves. So, an individual who's at this point of Rav Ganti, a person who's in 1946 is just screaming at God and never leaves that place. And I was zocheh to meet those people as well. I had a cousin, my wife's cousin, who never recovered. He never recovered from that screaming. It was Kedusha, but it was broken. And my parents would sit with that cousin who was entirely broken from the Holocaust. And every Pesach and every Sukkot, my mother's devotion to that cousin who never married was mind-boggling. There were the same questions. My father, Olav Shalom, would say to him, for what I remember, 30 years, there are no answers. I don't have an answer. My cousin Jack would say to my father Shmuel Chaim, my son's name is Shmuel Menachem, the Shmuel is after his father. Shmuel Chaim was a big Oved Alexander Chassid. So when my father was taken out from the ghetto, I looked up at my father, and my father, as he was walking out, he raised his hands and he said, "Es darf sein Mashiach Zeiten." It must be Mashiach's time. This is when they were taken, I believe, to Auschwitz, because Jack was in Auschwitz for a few years. My cousin Jack was one of Mengele's experiments. That's why he never married. And in my house, he was Kodesh Kodashim. So a person could stay and understandably say at this place of Eta Ole Apadne B'tzal Maves. And no one can question why there were people that stayed in that place. But then there are great, great people who somehow took the question of Lama to Lama. The one who made this famous, as I know, in Eretz Yisrael was Mrs. Racheli Frankel, Naftali Frankel, Hashem Yikom Dama's mother. And she turned her life mission into Lama. To Lama. Turning the Lama to Lama. And in our Beis Medrash, going from the tragedies and pains of Klal Yisrael to our personal tragedies. There's not a day that goes by that I don't ask myself, Lama on Rabbi Yosef, Lama on Reb Simcha, and now Lama on Rabbi Yonatan. But we have to turn it into Lama. and that we learned from Reb Simcha Zatzal, Dikduk HaMitzvos she'en kamo. I never met a medakdik b'mitzvos like Reb Simcha Lauer Zatzal. One of the many things from Rabbi Yonatan Cohen was his ability to be mesameach, truly mesameach in other people's simchas. What the world knows from Joko's status is his ability to connect and create. For some of his good friends here, it wasn't only that. He had a true, or maybe that was what HaKadosh Baruch Hu allowed, that tremendous koach for him to connect to people, was because he truly was misameach in every individual's success and their joys in their family. And that's what we have to take that lema. Ashrei ayin that saw Rabbi Yosef Newman's Simchas HaMitzvos is Simcha and Tefillah. So the first step of leaving Kinaches to the point that Chas v'Chalil we could get stuck, Ate Olei Apadnei B'Tzalmoves, is to go from the Lama to the Lama. And there are two other things that are basic to Klal Yisrael. Rabbi Elazar HaKalir, we don't even know. It's absolutely mind-boggling that we don't know when exactly he lived. And I've always thought that the reason why we don't know when he lived is so that the Kinnos could apply to every single generation. So we could speculate at what time, but it fits. It fits every generation because we don't know. In his genius, and in the genius of the Kinnos, is the ability to take Torah and use the words of Torah. We always return to the text of Torah to frame the way in which we process the Raganti. It becomes part of the process of Va'ata Ada Chag HaShamayim. And then there's one more part. In Yesh Lodun, maybe we have to have a shir after Mincha on this. On the one hand, the pasuk in Eicha says, Gam ki ezak v'ashavei sasam tfilasi, that when I cried to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, my tefillos were closed, sasam tfilasi. Yet at the same time, we do daven on Tisha B'Av. The yoser mizeh, I was blown away when I realized that, take a look at Kinavav. I've mentioned this years ago. Take a look at Kinavav. What letter does it start with? After Shavas, we spoke about Shavas. How does the Kinnos on Tisha B'Av morning begin? It begins with the letter Samach. You see that? Suri meni shemuni oivrai. Schiu mozes simuni bedrei chavai. Then we go on. You have the Nun, Nafla. And then the Art Scroll does a very good job. They bold it. Then we have these next letters that are with Ayin. Oidenu bitzul dechuya. Eini chiksa lechazoin ben brachya. Then we go on to Pei. I never asked this question, but Talmidei Chachamim and scholars ask this question. Why are we starting in the middle of the Aleph base? So the answer is that if you take a look at the Kinnos from Rome over 1,000 years ago, the Kinnos actually begin in Chazaras Hashatz. For those of us who grew up davening Nusach Svard, so there are piyutim in Chazaras Hashatz. The piyutim, the Kinnos started as a form of piyutim, many Talmidei Chacham have argued, in Shmona Esrei. The Gra conquered the world, and with the Gra, all this whole world was forgotten. My father, I remember the first time when I came back from yeshiva and I stopped saying piyutim, I saw my father look up from the piyut and he looked at me as if I was from Mars. My father was probably right. I probably shouldn't have stopped. It's a kasha why we daven Nusach Ashkenaz here all together. But the point is that piyutim were a big part of Klal Yisrael, and there's Rav Soloveitchik Darshan, a lot of Rav Soloveitchik's drashos and halachos came from the piyutim. The piyutim were written by the Gedolei Arishonim. And it seems that the Kinnos themselves were a part of Tefillah. Kinnos was a part of Tefillah. Of course, this whole idea of explanatory Kinnos v'chule is mamish, Yeridas Hadoros. Once upon a time, people opened up the Kinnos, they said the words, then boom, that was all they needed. Yeridas Hadoros. But the point is, again, that there are three ways in which we take the Raganti and turn it to be Adar Chog HaShamayim. Number one is we take the Lama, the Lama, and we turn it into Lama. Number two is we look at the Sfarim of Tanakh and we look at the Sfarim of Chazal to be able to get a perspective. And number three is we turn to Tefillah. And in fact, that's what we're going to have at the end of Kinnos. At the end, actually, just a few lines later, remember we stopped at the top of page 164. Ete olaya padni b'tzal moves, atusa v'eshkeno ad chatzar moves. If you go down a few lines later, you have Ekof lecha roish Hashem cheli, echra lecha berech lachatel machli. Last year we spoke about the significance of the berech. I will bend to you my head to you, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and I will bow my knee to you in tefillah. So, on the one hand, I leave off as a tzarachian. There are beautiful answers to this. On the one hand, we have Gam ki ezak v'shavei asasam tefillasi. Yet, of course, the way out is gufa, this idea that we saw from Rabbi Sharon Shateslo, even to scream to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but b'toras tefillah. These are the three things: lema, Torah, and tefillah. We'll say Kinnos, and what we're going to do is stop by the words Achtircha b'shir mishirei micholi. Right after we speak about tefillah, or maybe Hainu Hach, as an expression of tefillah, I had always felt that for myself, and I think many others in this generation have this feeling as well, that Chazal, Gedolei HaChasidus already speak about this, that Nigun is the petach, is a big opening towards one's neshama and in avodas Hashem. And I always felt that not only the Chevra stuck around last night and they sang together, but I thought that even in Kinnos itself it was appropriate to sing. And then when I noticed this in Kinnos, Achtircha b'shir mishirei michelai. How does Art Scroll translate this? I shall crown you with song, with the melodies of my machlas. Machlas was one of the kelim that was used in the Beis Hamikdash. Achavei mi tencha ka'achli. Here, Mamish, the Kinnos describes being machtir HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to be through all the pain, for us to crown HaKadosh Baruch Hu through Nigun. So we'll reach up until this, and then we will sing to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in pain and in sadness, and then finish off the Kina. Adad chug hashamayim aleiti shamayim or yoy machrivi pamayim esoinem teim roish mayim. Evchim bivchi lel midbar, evchana lel milel midbar mi midbar. Avakeiti yoy las midbar, ashag mi yitnei va midbar. Egodav enoshel kinoi kef zayis, agoreiti kol bnei voyis. Egroim sheyoimar balabayis, aroshem yitnei shomir v'shayis. Adve b'chol lev lehamtzi ehu, edo milin bom lehamtzeyu, adeh kayei royev lo yemtzeyu, ekoinei mi yiten yodati v'emtzeyu, eyofcho v'esapcho koifon b'milai, egeponim b'fonim l'sanoi samolai, ohahu cheres v'sar milhagia l'mulai, etzrach mi yitein efoi v'kosvun miloi. Oy rach mishpetei goin veyali, oy diabi vitzi umali, ulum azalois bekorimili, efemi tein shoy meyali. Az daku fra eviino as kraki yisi mutana mechutana as il plugim givrecha yoino gormi ten liever kayoino och nivsham bikirias ois altsor och ubli mai baaf latsor och as komois litzor voilois litzor sichun yovileni motzor Utahole apadne bitzamoves atusavesh koino atchat sarmoves etofeles amechakim lamoves anami kever yichiev lo yirmoves ilusi lezrosi tarti chazois ilusi b'chol shanoi mersi v'shanazois ilusi b'chol shanoi mersi hashanazois koif l'chol roish adinoi cheli echol l'chol derech l'chadel mechli Achtircha b'shir mishirei michoili achavei mi yitencho ki ochli. Rabban Spiegel Zatzal was a child survivor of the Holocaust. I was his Talmud for many, many years, and even though I spoke about the Churban of Europe constantly with my father, but for some reason I didn't raise the issue too much with my Rebbe, one of my great Rebbeim. One time I was confused at how many siblings Rabban Spiegel had, so I said to him, Rebbe, how many siblings do you have? Both of his parents miraculously survived with him. He said, when the war started, we had 7, and when the war was over, there were 3. Rabban Spiegel was quite young. He said he didn't have that many memories. Most of his memories are the Mesiras Nefesh that his parents had for Torah mitzvahs. His mother baking matzahs. Around the Nazis began to start hunting Jews who were preparing for Pesach a little bit before Purim. So his mother would bake matzahs. They were in a labor camp, not a death camp. There'd been no way he would have survived. He was so small, Rabban Spiegel was hidden through most of the war in the concentration camp itself. He said they had a game called hide and seek. And he thought it was a game, but what it really was a game of life and death, that when the Nazis would come by, he was told to hide in a particular place. Ulai, that's the pshat of 7 to 3, I don't know. There is a video that the Shoah Foundation, one of the foundations, I don't know, did of my interviewing my Rebbe, where there is more detail. The Rebbe described that he remembers the Jews singing the Ani Mamin that the legend has was written on the trains to the gas chambers and was sent to the Mozhitzer Rebbe. My Rebbe said he remembers the Jews singing it. In Rav David Feinsteig's book, he makes reference to this Ani Mamin as well, the Jews singing it after the war in the DP camps. And Rabban Spiegel asked us the only time he spoke in Yeshivas Rabbeinu Yitzchak Kalchan about his experiences in the Holocaust, he immediately after he spoke, he asked us to sing this Ani Mamin. And I want to get the nusach as meduyak as possible. As Ramosha Wolfson, this is the way my brother Shlita told me, the Ramosha Wolfson at Shalosh Shudas, this is how they would sing. Ramosha Wolfson would ask them to sing the Ani Mamin with this nusach. Ani Mamin, Ani Mamin, Ani Mamin. Be'emuna she'veleveima Oy beve second to last paragraph at the end of Kinnos. We now say, Al tishkach tzakas Ariel. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, don't forget those tzakos. Immediately previous to that, about 6 lines above, right before we mentioned Ekof L'cha Rosh Hashem HaCheli, the reference to Tefillah, we make it. There's a reason why HaKadosh Baruch Hu loves Am Yisrael. Ayumasi b'chol shana omeres hi hashana zos. My great uncle Shmuel Chaim Hashem Yikom Damon, he's let out of the ghetto. He says, "Zdar zayin Mashiach Tzaitin." Ayumasi b'chol shana omeres hi hashana zos. Every year for 2,000 years, we've been saying this is the year. And what are we left with? Al tishkach tzakas Ariel. Al tishkach tzakas Ariel. Elov legor Yudav Yisrael. Al feishino nasher mosarel. Yisrael meis b'drachai lo yolochu azavuni v'azavtim ufanai mehem nepochu roganti ve'elalti ume'ai v'libi nishbachu eicha sefarti mirashoy sahi hishlichu. Kinnos ends with a response from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu responds. HaKadosh Baruch Hu responds and says, Yisrael me'es b'drachai lo halachu. Ultimately, what has happened is that we have veered from Ratzon HaKadosh Baruch Hu. First Beis HaMikdash, the Gimel Chamuros, by Sheni Sinas Chinam, every door needs to make its own cheshbon of what tikkun that it needs to make. And that continues into Kinnos. In Kinnos, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, not only has Klal Yisrael as Yechidim been perverse, and corrupt, but also its leaders. HaKadosh Baruch Hu responds, how you've thrown my splendor from your head. Lama sariva alai kulchem. Why is it you think that your questions are legitimate? Chasku alai divrechem miyetchem oisaz oislachem. Ultimately, mipnei chatoenu galinu mi'artzenu. And not only chatoenu as yechidim, the Kinnos continues, bila shoiftai b'moetzos ivsam. That even your manhigim have made deep errors. Ufanim hister mehem kishar avosasam. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu concealed his countenance from Klal Yisrael's leaders when he saw their perverseness. This line, Ufanim hister mehem, for my father Olav Hashalom and my Rabbeim, was extremely, extremely important. There was a great Gadol b'Torah about 30 years ago that said that the Holocaust had come about due to certain Averos. And Reb Branspiegel Zatzal said, he came into Shir, I don't think it was immediately after, he was very, very careful about how he would respond to Gedolei Torah. He's aru begachal ascham. But Reb Branspiegel was careful within that year to say, I was there, ani ageva ra ani, that's how his sefer begins. And I can tell you that the only way to describe it is Hester Panim. Hester Panim, of course, biklali mipnei chatoenu galim be'artzeinu. But a Rav, 50 years later, even one of the Manhigei Adar, to point to this or to point to that, that was the Yisod Gadol that I heard from my father, that there are times that Manhigim have Hester Panim. We can't explain why so many tzaddikim perished. Rav Ruvain Schreier, who is Zocha that he learns and davens in our Beis Medrash, shared with me something that he's been writing, and he concluded that piece with his description when he learned in yeshiva with Reb Tzvi. And he writes, on my way back to my dorm room late at night, I began returning the svarim I had collected from the Beis Medrash over the course of the day. On my way back of the Beis Medrash, a young, diligent Talmid Chacham was still sitting there poring over a tzais. As I passed my friend Zachariah Haber, looked up from his sefer, and flashes me his priceless smile. His face was glowing. In that simple memory, there was something so raw, so powerful, that even years later it still feels fresh. I don't have the words to articulate why. But at that moment, deep into a cold winter night, I was witnessing a glorious sight, a beautiful moon shining into darkness. Within this young masmid was the pulsating light of Yosef, the power that could illuminate all of creation. Years later, as Zechariah fought to defend Klal Yisrael from our enemies in Operation Swords of Iron, his unique light was extinguished, and we were left to mourn the loss of another precious, irreplaceable son of Yosef. Rachel Imenu refuses to be comforted. Her wails are piercing. Hester Panim. My father went even further. My father said Hester Panim does not only apply to tzaddikim, to those who are moser nefesh al kiddush Hashem, who are tzaddikim, as my great uncle Reb Shmuel Chaim Hashem Yikam Damo, as Zechariah Haber Zechariah Yikam Damo. But he also applies, as we saw in the Kinnos, to leadership. I think we're living in a time of Hester Panim and Klal Yisrael's leadership as well. My nature is that when a tragedy happens, I want to understand why. I was in Miron. What year was it? The stampede? 2021. Menachem and I were not far when that tragedy happened. And when I came home, I had to watch at 3, 4 in the morning. I wanted to see every video and every angle and understand, how did it happen? How did it happen? How did it happen? One of the Talmidim that I walked into Miron with in Torah Shraga, there was a video, he was pulled out last minute. I was with him. And then there were those that didn't come out. And the teva that I have is I want to understand how. Simchas Torah, post Simchas Torah, Tavshin Pei Gimel. I wanted to understand how. How could such a thing happen? And we don't know the answers, but it seems to me that those of us who want to understand how, and I'm talking particularly Simchas Torah Tavshin Pei Gimel, and what has happened afterwards, is that's Hester Panim. It doesn't make any sense that the political leadership didn't notice it. It doesn't make any sense that the military leadership didn't notice it. And in some ways, we're still living that Hester Panim. It seems to me that the Manhigim are in a state of Hester Panim. And in a way, when I come to that conclusion, it's almost paralyzing. The dawn of the Geula is going to come, and halavai, we should be close. But from the leadership down, it seems that we're in a time, I'm talking about political leadership, religious leadership, it seems that we're at a time of Hester Panim. And it's not new, unfortunately, to the history of Klal Yisrael and Golus. What's new is that we're in Eretz Yisrael. But unfortunately, there have been times of Hester Panim in Eretz Yisrael as well. But the Kotzker Rebbe Zechusei Yagin Aleinu gave us a way out. The Kotzker Rebbe wasn't only strong. He wasn't only harsh. He wasn't only a fire of Emes that burned into his Talmidim. If you go deep into the Kotzker Rebbe Zechusei Yagin Aleinu, and I think most don't capture this, there is a tremendous amount of strength that he could give us as well. And Kotzker Rebbe said that when I was young, I wanted to change the world. And then I wanted to change the country. And then I wanted to change my city. And as I've got older and older and older, I realized that what I have to do is work on Menachem Mendel himself. There are certain things, Rabbosai, right now in the Hester Panim that might be beyond our ability to be Masakin. HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows what he's doing. He will be Masakin. But the Hester Panim, in terms of the Pilug in Klal Yisrael, the right and the left, the religious and the secular, and within the religious community, Charedi, Dati, Lumi, some of those things are almost beyond our ability alone to be Masakin. But we, in this Dalet Amis, we have a responsibility to be Masakin. Hacking about what's going on in the news isn't going to create the tikkun. But we, in our own Dalet Amis, have to create the tikkun. And from that, b'siyata d'shmaya, from that will come a leadership. And from that, b'siyata d'shmaya, will come HaKadosh Baruch Hu's unique providence of Klal Yisrael to bring the Geula. And therefore, our responsibility, I'm saying Dvarim Pshutim, is to embrace everybody, even if you disagree with them. We don't compromise a standard of an iota of our standards. We could strongly disagree, and Baruch Hashem, in our great base medrash, we have people who strongly disagree with each other. Ashrecha Yisrael, Ashrecha Mevakshei Emes. But we could still embrace with each other, daven with each other, dance with each other, cry with each other. And maybe that will be a little bit of art that will dispel a lot of chayshech. Let's continue with Kinnos. Echa tefarti mirasho sayishlichu, knei kisei hakavod tzelem himlichu, b'chalam t'nai asher choyzer nimlachu, v'nohom b'chukoisai teilichu. V'ma surivu alai kolchem chosku al divreichem yetchem oisas lachem bila shoivtai b'moyatzois ivisam ufanim histir mehem kishor avososam v'yumar lavok nitrom lahavisam chelef v'nosati gishmechem b'itam schi uma'oi samani kilo v'apoi v'yistemeni yichumov meira yishashuni Godarum karnovi lumamik tzir uvavchoi uvivchois cherev shareihem heitzir mizei rov os bakotzir timur v'yisig lachem dayish es kotzir darakashtoi v'chilo v'cheretz v'chaber zelipel shmei eretz paratzani shloish esrei peretz tachas v'nosati shalom boretz v'yutzerchem umuschem miskabchem Hafach lachzor v'nilcham bochem, hanoitzarchem richakchem, Choshachem tiavchem, vayehav techosru daftem es oivechem, ve'achmois pinas sedet mileyot, umaskios hamotza kol tumo, umechabdei zilua kedava mituma, v'shinui v'rodfu mikem chamisha meya, zanachel yon kiryas moyadechem, ve'hevil sarei chil amidas raglechem, Mivikesh zois pots viglechem, v'gamar oimer ofenisi alechem, Choshav Sinoi, Oim Lukat Kashoishan, Michalevoy Leo Isotishon, Kitorchu Pasahu ala Kikivshon, Shalo Ayetagon, Timur Vachaltem Yoshon Narshon. Tonich say Roivdei Duchani, Bigay Hamas Kinektal Mechani, Harei Kama Shonim, Gilo Yisoy Mechani, Somi Toichi Oimer V'Nosati Mishkani, Yashvu Mevakim Minakas Meisechen, Baba Misoy Sipil Mesechen, Cherev Rov Chayiv Edever Shichas, Sotzilon Pots, Visalachti Vesaychem, Kol Lushoy Kiregal Mechem. V'chem nishbu ma'alechem, v'chaychem nishbuchu nifshoy, Soy V'chem Asom Siachani Adonai, Eloyechem. Moi dechi shishayich im gurayich, bois asu hamirim al sus nonus al keinos. Piti simuch negdi heshivu azois, vanachta v'sachti, afani es azois, sofku chorkus, shorku moinai, nevifnim mechutz. Neizedi mechulutz nifim. May eis klas v'nom vish avarti es gizos koitz akoyoy v'ashpos Kumi dovki shavi al domi usnicho oy meretz kolech v'toimi mirosh ashkeni vidmi shakam binu v'imtel choli egal v'yiso sam l'royim yes v'kas v'baris koylo kinu yes v'soro Shavu v'ilov kesoy milchmor v'imtel l'hamleim gar v'imar peor l'hamleim shem hamamani l'eskala shem kekuach v'imdeva Afani lochud biyoike shikaroin arva simcha v'hishpis charoin lo aretz eishei v'gevi garoin eicha yoshva chavtzeles hasharoin. Kina Yud is a fascinating kina because it describes the mishmaros of the Beis Hamikdash. You take a look in Art Scroll, page 174 on the bottom, quote the Gemara in Tainis, that there are 24 mishmaros kahuna. Each mishmar served for 1 week on a rotation basis. And here, the names of the different mishmaros of Bayis Rishon, as enumerated in Divrei Hayomim, Perek Dalid, are enumerated over here in Kina Yud. Why is mentioning mishmaros important when it comes to Avelos on the Beis Hamikdash? It's striking because there are many parts of the Avodas Beis Hamikdash that are not enumerated in the Kinnos, yet Kina Yud emphasizes Dafka the Mishmaros. The Rambam in his Pirush HaMishnayis in Midas, Perek Aleph Mishnah Aleph, writes the following: V'da elu hashoimrim sheshoimrim hamikdash al pi hamishmaros eino machmas pachad aval zeh derech gedula lebayis lekavod v'yakar v'chein hayu shomrim ad solv kol adoris. There's a question of girsa here in the Rambam. Some have the girsa ad omei olamim, but many of the achronim stop at this very, very interesting lashon. Ad solv kol adoros, they're mefalpa whether there's a din of shmiras hamikdash even when the Beis Hamikdash has been destroyed. The Rambam says, At Seif Kol Adayros. A fascinating, fascinating question. But of course, the Rambam's thrust is to emphasize that the role of Shmira isn't to guard from physical attack to the Beis Hamikdash, but the Rambam's lashon is derech gedula lebayis lekavod v'yakar. There's an expression in English, to guard in one's heart. It seems what the Rambam is describing is that there always is supposed to be a shmira for the Mikdash to emphasize that we haven't forgotten the kavod v'yakar of the Beis Hamikdash. In other words, just like lahavdil el falfei avdalos, in Buckingham Palace, there's a changing of the guard. And the changing of the guard has a beautiful ceremony that comes along with it. So too, in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, maybe they even got it from us. In the time of the Beis Hamikdash, there was a celebration of the changing of the guard, the 24 mishmaros. L'davonenu, for those who have spent time in the old city, who've been zocheh to spend time in the old city. What is the changing of the guard? Now I see the soldiers coming down from the Temple Mount, worn out, exhausted. There's no kavod right now in the changing of the guards. Even though harabayis biyodenu, it's not the changing of the guard that it once was. Now they're there machmas pachad. And we're not yet there for kavod v'yakar. A painful example that we are still in Golus. The Rambam's emphasis that Kedushas HaMikdash is celebrated and protected not because of pachad might be relevant in terms of looking at our Shivas Tzion, us being zocheh to come back to Eretz Yisrael. In the writings of the early Zionist leaders, they emphasized that the return to Eretz Yisrael in the 19th century would solve anti-Semitism. Well, we now know that that was entirely wrong. We didn't return to Eretz Yisrael machmas pachad. We returned to Eretz Yisrael lekavod v'yakar HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We didn't come back to Eretz Yisrael because it's easier. We came back to Eretz Yisrael because it's a mitzvah and because we could attain greater spiritual heights in Eretz Yisrael. We came back to Eretz Yisrael because HaKadosh Baruch Hu has, as Rav Soloveitchik described, has been dofek. He's knocking and he's been calling to us to come back. We did not come back simply for nationalistic reasons. We came back for spiritual reasons. And therefore we understand that if returning to Eretz Yisrael brings more anti-Semitism to the world, and anti-Semitism is irrational, but if it does, and if it has a part to it, that doesn't faze us. It's scary, it's concerning, but it doesn't faze us. One of the beautiful songs that I've heard soldiers sing, I don't know who came up with these words, but I would say, Im Lav Nevi'im B'nei Nevi'im Hem, a beautiful tune to a Breslover Niggin, Am HaNetzach Lo Mefached Miderech Haruka. There might be a Derech Haruka still ahead of us, and the Geula might come tomorrow. But Am HaNetzach Lo Mefached Miderech Haruka. Lo machmas pachad, machmas yikar v'chavod. Kadosh Baruch Hu should be mezaka us, that we should be zelcha to see the Yakar and Kavod, the Beis Hamikdash with the Mishmaros. Eicha Yashva Chavtzeles Hasharon, V'dam Amron, Mipnei Noisei Aron. No, mi mishrasam koyani b'nei Aharon. K'nim sar b'ais marzor ve'imoroi. V'chaysev gem michumesh asfarim. K'nei kayim v'naviv yom ha'gimot. V'shtu protim k'tzfirim. V'kitzikurim koyanei tziporim. Golsa me'arza kala mikushata. B'avoy masrois u'shmito. V'arba shvatim u'shpata. Me'edov shata mishmeres mivshata. Darchei heichal shamamu kinifratz kosloi. V'amil kinikra pisiloi. Hurat v'ushpal mitiloi. V'nom v'shsiloi koyein aisoloi. Hoyu oivim alivim b'loi chamei lochem kivitlu. Haloi farois lo reiv lechem v'uravuvu tzmu min bayim umi lechem. V'shtein lechem v'beis lechem. Beis lechem. Eitzei adaroim b'kesef nefbos u'smurai fera roisham chipas. V'sham belechem ufas nil kedol yudbos. Zachro zman asher nasa v'nishma yeshivu. Chet chata v'amra lo elil ze'el v'liga v'tzitol b'choy ze'el. Tumas so'ech nifaso. Yodoi parasar b'veisevu. Kichlo yochu yavti kedoram mabu. Kol amo koinenu kino. Loi lama roi mayin sofas. V'das loy teres nipas. Mi moro mishmi ani leisita oin. Vi kan bi varonu v'shigoin. Persavein yod shaleaki lo yamina bashkim v'shaloyach v'shpasa b'smela. Sadiku adonai kifihu moraz, varu aru adonai yisoid vahu araz. Re'eki usarti koniyo b'saniyo v'aniyo. Shati v'shalo. Tavoi samriya v'chosh. Tavoi samriach v'choshki tazriach. V'chadesh atzmoi seinu tafriach. V'reach nichoy chenu kikedem toriach. Mishulchan chotariach. Shulei chamas ariach. Up to Kino Yud Vayikoinen Yirmiyahu al Yoshiyahu. This makes reference to the lost opportunity of Yoshua HaMelech, who had led a tremendous hero tshuva. There's a great summary of it in the art scroll on page 182. Many of you are familiar with the story. I mentioned in the past that my friend Rav Ram Willig points out that the word avelus in the biblical context, in the Torah, is used for missed opportunities. Vayisabolu Klal Yisrael, when they realized that they had made a mistake with the Meraglim, that's how the term avel is used. Maybe we could suggest that also the biblical term of kina is also used in the context of mixed opportunities. Vayikoinen Yirmiyo al Yoshio, that Yoshio had led a tremendous hero tshuva, and the opportunity was lost. I've spoken about Hester Panim of this Tkufa, but there's something else that must be addressed that we alluded to, but needs to be addressed more directly. The Sefer Lechem Dima makes a beautiful diuk in the pasuk in Hecha. Hayud sareha larosh, oyeveha shalu. Our enemies, they became larosh. They were the ones who dominated, and they plundered Klal Yisrael. The Sefer Lechem Dibba makes a beautiful diuk. Sareha means Klal Yisrael's enemies in the plural. Larosh means that they came together as one. Is it plural or is it singular? And the obvious answer is that they started off with differing agendas, but they all came together as with Achdus to destroy Klal Yisrael. Rashi at the end of the Sefer Midbar describes that's Midian and Moab. That Midian and Moab, despite the fact that they hated each other, they came together to fight Klal Yisrael. The theme of Achdus is something that when we fail in Achdus, our enemies are able to be ma'ached against us. Three years ago, there was a lot of Hester Panim, but there was a lot of Achdus. But it seems like we haven't held on to it. And in some ways, we're worse off than we were 3 years ago. Achdus isn't easy. I mentioned a beautiful idea from Rav Shaloni at the beginning of Kinnos. My son reminded me of it. My son said that he was going to say it over at another Kinnos somewhere else. So I asked my son, this was in a Haredi Kinnos. So I asked my son, are you going to quote Rav Shaloni by name? He was one of my Dati Leumi colleagues in the Tivaya. And my son looked at me, of course. Mevi Geula La'olam. So Baruch Hashem, I passed that test. He passed that test. But Rabbosai, in order for that to happen, you know how many steps of Achdus you need to have reached that point? Rav Shaloni learned, I just want to trace one particular two friends and their history together, and how many steps you need to be able to maintain Achdus and not let your differences come between you. Rav Shaloni learned in yeshiva, went to Yeshiva Flatbush, then to Yeshiva HaKotel. And in Yeshiva HaKotel, even though it's a Hesder Yeshiva, Rabbi Bina understood that even though Rav Branchbiegel was Haredi, that would be best for Rav Shaloni's learning to go to Rav Branchbiegel's Shir. Step one of Achdus. Recognizing that despite differences, there's greatness on both sides. Rav Shaloni, when he finished in Rav Branchbiegel's Shir, he approached Rav Branchbiegel. Rav Branchbiegel recognized that he wanted to go back to Eretz Yisrael to a Hesder Yeshiva. That would be best for him to go back in Eretz Yisrael to a Hesder Yeshiva. Rav Shaloni after I left Netiv Aryeh, recognized that for Achdus, it was good for him to come back and visit me during Kinnos. During Kinnos, my son heard Rav Shaloni when he was in a Haredi yeshiva, and he recognized that someone from a Hesder background is actually worth listening to. Do you see how many steps Rabbosai need to be taken to create Achdus? And you see how easy that one stereotype or one bias could break down the Achdus of Klal Yisrael. You'll ask a question, though. But what if I believe another Jew's positions are the cause of our problems? That Klal Yisrael is suffering because of their position? The answer is that assumption is erroneous. You could believe that another position is mistaken, is deeply wrong, but to blame someone else in Klal Yisrael, that is the line that we're not supposed to pass. The Gemara tells us that Titus HaRasha did not destroy the Beis HaMikdash, as the Nefesh Chaim elaborates. Kimcha tchina techinta. That ultimately the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed due to our Averos. Klal Yisrael suffers due to our Averos, and to pin it onto somebody else in any direction is wrong. And I'm going to read exactly the words that I said last year, which are strong, but I think still relevant. Fortunately, some of the examples have to be changed, but the point is the same. Therefore, if a Haredi Jew points a finger at the government and claims they are against Torah because he no longer gets nursery schooling for his children, and L'davaonenu, I have to add, and also his children are being arrested for learning Torah while others do not, he's missing the point. When HaKadosh Baruch Hu causes him to suffer, it's because HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants him to make a cheshbon nefesh. That refers to me. But the same applies to a Dati Lumi person. If he points to a quagmire in Lebanon or Gaza and blames the leftist influences in the government, or a figure at the Haredim who don't share in serving in the army, he's missing the point. Every tzibur and its suffering has to make a cheshbon nefesh within the tzibur itself. If the average Israeli points a finger at Ariel Sharon and the left-wing government and blames them, he's missing the point. All of the above are in a logical place of olam hazeh. They're logical. They might seem to make sense, although ultimately we reach a point when we try to figure it out and it still has to upon him. But that's not an excuse. You know what the Rambam writes? If a person explains the suffering of somebody else, b'derech hateva, writes the Rambam in Ilchos Tshuva, harezu achzarios. Our suffering, our collective suffering, whatever shevet we're in, and hopefully each shevet is able to feel the collective suffering of another shevet, all this beautiful Yud Bei Shvatim, we're supposed to perceive that suffering through the perspective of cheshbon hanefesh, of making ourselves better. That's what the Rambam writes. Harezu midas achzarius. We're being achzari to ourselves and we're being achzari to others. And we had an opportunity. I don't know if we have to write a kinno yet on it. But we had an opportunity for Achdus, and we had that Achdus, and somehow it's eluded us once again. I want to move on to an entirely different point in regards to Vaikonin Yirmiyahu al Yoshio. There are two versions about what happened with Yoshio. There's a Medrash, and there's a Gemara in Tainis on Chav Beis Amud Beis. Marsha over there tries to reconcile. According to the Gemara's version, Yoshio, who led an entire hero tshuva in Klal Yisrael, but did not know that there were still Ovrei Aveira who were hiding Avodah Zarah behind their doors, was in many ways provoked by Paro Necho through Chil Hashem to respond. The Gemara describes that Paro Necho was publicizing his own success against Klal Yisrael and passing through Eretz Yisrael due to his Avodah Zarah, a public Chil Hashem. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu had promised, V'cherev lo savor ba'artzechem. So Yoshio stands up to defend the Chil Hashem of the Cherev lo savor ba'artzechem. And the tragedy is even deeper than that, according to Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz. In the Yo'oraz Dvash, Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz says, the Gemara says, Shelo nimlach b'Yirmiyahu tchila, that what Yoshio should have done is he should have asked Yirmiyahu, he should have asked advice, he should have asked Gedolei Torah, or to the terms that we use today, he should have asked a Shaila. And he should have, but it wasn't Pashut, Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz points out. Because the Gemara in Yuma Nun Beis Amud Beis says that Yoshio had been nignaz the Aron, and therefore, the Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz has rayas that the Urim V'Tumim only works when the Aron is b'mikomo. If the Aron is not b'mikomo, then the Urim V'Tumim doesn't work. So Yoshio's hands were tied. Yoshio didn't have the ability to consult the Urim V'Tumim. He was stuck. He was in a difficult place. He had to make a difficult decision. He was clearly coming with totally sincere intentions and responding to Chil Hashem, V'cherev lo savar ba'artzechem, that everybody sees the hero tshuva, and yet the psukim don't seem to be fulfilled. That's a tragedy. He still should have asked, even though he didn't have the Urim V'Tumim. And Rabosai, here is the practical lesson. Most mistakes are made when the situation is ideal, and then a costly judgment mistake is made. We take matters into our own hands, usually not when it's easy to ask, but for whatever reason the situation is more complicated than the standard, and then costly mistakes are made. The solution to it, I speak to myself and we speak together as chaverim, is to ask, is not to assume, is to be humble, to have humility to say, I don't know. To have humility to say, there were certain assumptions that I made in the United States of America, and my family was deeply affected by the culture of America, and I'm not sure what exactly is the right way of how to adjust into Eretz Yisrael. On a totally different note, but in the exact same context, or a totally different context, but the same point, my wife said that her first Kala class with Rebbetzin Shmuel Levitz, she said that the first class was one message, and that is, never be afraid to ask a shaila. Never assume that it's mutter or it's aser. Ask, ask, ask. By the way, in regards to fast days, ask. Don't assume you can't eat, ask. Of course, that point was made in the context of Taras HaMishpacha, but it applies to every part of life. Mesilas Yesharim describes this beautiful, simple mashal Mesilas Yesharim's mashal is that there are people who've already gone through the maze. And we, when going through it, is very, very, very difficult. And sometimes all it requires is life's experience to be able to see the maze from above. To turn to people who are not perfect, but people who have done the maze, who are familiar with it, who are familiar with the challenges. But sometimes there's our ego that gets in the way. Lost opportunities don't only come about because of gross failures, but they sometimes come about because of subtle mistakes. And we have to daven for siyata d'shmaya. Whenever we start something that's new, and what we're doing is something that's colossal new, simply being here for the first time in 2,000 years, we need to have the appropriate anava to be able to get the appropriate hadracha, and to daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the siyata d'shmaya to be able to do it correctly. Vayikoin in Yirmiyahu Yoishiyahu. Echeli koninu me'elav ben shmona shana hechel lidrosh me'elav b'nei cham b'avram chanu alav l'skar lo yisigui mifala gam b'chol malchei Yisrael asher kamu ligdor lo kam kamo mimois avigdor levak b'y chet lo yitzonei hador asher kamu achar adeles listor hoichlim zera shichor kismoy hatoif pichamoy mishkor vayigdal avoin ve'yishiv yamin achor void lo yishalach yodoi min achor Zaku Amarav Kinom Das Lahakim Itzaim Rasoi Borur Asher Lo Yokim Choshach Toroi Kiniatsu Rechoikim Bevetz Amoy Seidos Vichukim Toivim Roim Nikru B'Shol Choy Malach Maliva Loch Hayoim L'Salach Yidei Amoretz Damim B'Malach Teanesh B'Vitzias Penei Filoch Kilo Hamoinai Leches Aram Naharoim Man Lo Yitzavor Cherev Koshu B'Efraim V'Lo Yisham Alach Chayzel Shuv Acharayim Gzera nigzera l'sachsech Mitzrayim b'Mitzrayim mechatois sirois mezuzos chazoyan susi heichalu levazois ma'uanomim lechumoy lehavzois v'isei poni v'softu alzois suru heidu ad loishiyah v'imonu sur matin loishiyah Nikoroi kikarei v'lo also lo ritia v'yeru hamoyrim lamelech yoishiyah Oidenu oitzem eino v'gev yoinoi chatzim cheitzach archeitz moirim l'loi chatzim Sodu v'samuhu kematoro lachitzim eizugu v'ishloish me'es chitzim Nefesh masav hifiu, ruach svasav hiftzah pipiu, tzadik ladeinoi kimari sofiu. Sisi noiv kikinei zam, l'shalem shoinam bavoim bitsam, tam kesem atoy vamzu b'afasham, ve'ikoinin alav kol echa yuam. Tom b'mikre echad kois migidoi l'ishtois, moichnas hashmita keko hakel asois, tola besrim u'shtayim haros shasois, kisavtu lo echa besrim u'shtayim loisois. Oisois Kinnos lubuta michaili lubata michaili es kishachti michaili zamoisi kilo ad yahili roshati v'nosati v'nutash oli. We're going to go to Kinnos Yud Gimel. Skip Yud Beis. Eikoi. Of course, Eikoi is a play on Eicha, Ayeka. And now comes the question, Eikoi, where are all of the promises, many of the Nevi'im were Misnabe, Kosomar, Eikoi Oimar Karis La'av B'Fetzach. Where is the merit of the word Koi that you promised HaKadosh Baruch Hu B'Vris Bein HaBetzarim, Koi Yela Netzach. Koi is a description of clarity. This is how it's going to be. Koi Yezaracha. This is the way it's going to be. And what does the Kinnos continue with? In the second line, Ve'ein ata bulu atzamai beretzach. Behold how my bones are swallowed up murderously. Since Simchas Torah of Tavshin Pei Gimel, there have been over 2,000 Bnei Yisrael that have been killed. But there's another number that's almost been forgotten. We don't spend enough time thinking about that number, but there's another number that's just as overwhelming. Ve'ein ata bolu atzamai biretzach. There are over 6,000, unfortunately now probably, no, over 7,000 now. Mostly soldiers, but civilians as well, who are seriously injured. Close to 1,000 with life-changing injuries that will never be the same. The Baal Hakina is saying, Koi, there is a human being that is made with all of the Ramach Ivarim and Shesagidim, Vehinat, and how many of our brothers and sisters, Bulu Atzamai Beretzach, are missing limbs. Ey koye mer kares love fetzach, berispin absarim koye lenetzach, beinata bulu atzamai beretzach, lom elihim zanachta lenetzach, ey koye gosh keseloi love the ratzoi secha, nochoad koye pitui beidoi secha, beinata dakru kefelach reis vishnachta letzoi. V'tachas akudim nikudim b'mishois b'merkoi b'chashois inatovikachto ir milayot because some varak mitzri begin all the kodesh koi v'choi chutam b'nas koi Ey koi toy vishulak olam v'dercha koi semal shak lam lo dat alein hatoy yeshu like in the vase Ego Christus Chadosha Yisrael Chai Chai Markat Zois V'Vay Yisrael Is V'Nata Luaku Ben Aleim Las Samu Samu Ekoi Meshmau Mesho Ekoi Pots Lakovam Tatsaru Alayim Eish Mikdash Echo Ey koi ki chas leviim shleimecha koi saselem letarom leveis alamecha veinato roshu yishu shemavotz kol mishkan shlemecha Ey koi shiva shoifroi seretz koi sasu sheish yom lapil time let Before we wrap up this kina, let's take a look at the second and third to last paragraphs in the art scroll on page 196. Ei koi lekichas leviim shleimecha koisas elahem letaram leveis olamecha vein ata rashu v'yirishu shamecha le'eretz chilul mishkan shemecha. These two paragraphs, the one that also goes on the next one, Ei koi shivas shofreis aretz, many ways captures a big part of what we're missing today when we don't have the Beis Hamikdash. The third to last paragraph, where is the clarity for kichas leviyei shleimecha koisas elahem letaram leveis olamecha? Once upon a time, Klal Yisrael had a very particular derech to achieve tahara. There was a clarity of avoda. We had avoda, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu showed us how to do avoda. Nowadays, it's much more confusing. It's much more confusing. We're missing that clarity. So here, Rebbe Lezer HaKalir focuses in Eikoi Kichas Leviyim Shlemecha that the confusion of Galus, as much as we have halacha to guide us, there's still so many things that are confusing. And the next paragraph, the second to last paragraph, let's see that one. Eikoi Shivas Shoifreis Aretz. Koi Saseh Sheishisem Lahapil Chomel Aretz. Does anybody know what that's referring to? Where again, we're making reference to all the time HaKadosh Baruch Hu says with clarity, koi. Here it's koi saseh sheishem la'apil chomel haaretz. That's by Yoshua. HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Yoshua, for 6 days you'll walk around once the walls of Yericho, and then the seventh, koi saseh sheishem la'apil chomel haaretz. At the time when HaKadosh Baruch Hu is guiding us from the place of Geula, there's military clarity. And how much do we miss that today? That's part of Golus. Part of Golus is the inability for us to know what exactly is the next right thing to do. We're going to go on to Kina Yud Zayin. It's getting late. Let's skip to Kina Yud Zayin. This, of course, is probably the most heart-wrenching of all the Kinnos. Im toichalna nosh imperium ole tipuchem aleleili. This captures the greatest parts, most painful parts of Golus, of where a mother is not able to protect her child, where parents with no other choice were forced to create a sakana for their own children. There is an absolutely riveting religious version. Of course, the original diary of Anne Frank is spellbounding and is absolutely required reading. But what's emerged in the last few years is a book called The Unfinished Diary by Reb Chaim Yitzchak Wogelenter. I highly recommend, we've quoted from it in the past, and I highly recommend it. It was written by one of the Talmidim of Yeshivas Chachmei Lublin. He wrote the diary in hiding, and it's called The Unfinished Diary because he had a son that survived, and that son found out that his father had hidden the diary. His father was ultimately killed. He was in hiding, but eventually found by the Nazis and killed al Kiddush Hashem. And he wrote a running diary from 1941 through 1942. I've read from it in the past. Maybe I should have read more today from it. He describes hiding from the Nazis, and the greatest fear that Reb Branspiegel's parents had as well was that a child or a baby would divulge, usually through simply making a little bit of noise, would divulge their existence. And he describes, I believe it was one of his nephews or nieces, that there were sounds outside of Nazi soldiers and there was a baby who's probably hungry, who is crying. Can you imagine being in those moments? The last 10, 15 members of a family hidden in a barn, and the sounds of the Nazi dogs. And there's a baby that's crying. And so the mother holds the baby really, really close to try to comfort. The mother who's by now sapped from her milk. And then the sounds of the Nazis recede. And she opens up her lap, and the baby's dead. The baby had suffocated. My brother told me about a story about my 11th grade Rebbe. My 11th grade Rebbe, I had known his family had been in Shanghai during the war. But through a series of events, my brother's father-in-law had passed away, and my Rebbe, who actually, the first Rebbe I learned Iyun by, Rav Yitzchak Kaplinsky, Zechron Livracha, he passed away during COVID. His brother, at the Shiva for my brother's father-in-law, told the following story. He said his family was running away. And just to understand the geography a little bit, Poland shares a border with Lithuania and Germany. So of course, unfortunately, it was way too late. That's the Hester Punin that my father described. But when the Germans invaded in 1939, so all the Jews, as we've spoken about in the past, tried to run in the direction of Lithuania and Russia. Reb Chaim Moiser Grzhensky Zatzal, who passed away in 1940, just a few weeks after the Nazis had occupied, a few weeks after the Soviets had occupied Vilna. The Nazis didn't reach Vilna. The Lithuanians took over Vilna. Eventually, the Russians then pushed the Lithuanians out, and by then they began stamping out Torah. The communists began stamping out the Torah. Reb Chaim Moser Grzhensky broke out of heartache because all the yeshivas had run to Vilna, the yeshivas from closer to the German side. And Reb Chaim Moser passed away just a few weeks after that. Rav Hirschsprung, in his diary, describes that he ran from German-occupied Poland, and he wanted to speak to Reb Chaim Moser Grzhensky, and he had the schus and the joy to speak with Reb Chaim Moser Grzhensky in Limud and asked him advice. And he said that from that Reb Chaim Moser's study, he was doing his best to direct the thousands of yeshiva bachrim that were running away. And he said he came into Reb Chaim Moser after the Soviets occupied Vilna, and he said he was a different man. He had gone from gray entirely to white, and he already saw that the Reb Chaim Moser's days were numbered. So many of the Jews were running from the Polish-German border, running away towards the Russian side, towards Lithuania. That was scary, because you had to pass the Nazis and then pass through the Lithuanians who didn't want any Jews to go into Lithuania. That's how Rav Hirschsprung survived, and that's how the Kaplinsky family also survived. Now, there was another family of Gedolei Torah that were with the Kaplinsky family. I'm not going to say the name because I haven't verified the story, and I have a little bit of kashas about whether the identity of this family is correct, but it's a Gadol B'Torah that almost everybody here knows. They were running, Rav Kaplinsky said, they were running together with that family. And you needed to run past the Nazis and then past the Lithuanian border to be able to get to Vilna, which the Kaplinsky family made it to, and then Shanghai. As well as, I verified that this Gadol's family, also their family survived that way, although other accounts have a different description of what happened. And Rabbi Kaplinsky said that as they were running along, there was a forest that they needed to run through that the smugglers were taking them through. And there was a baby that was with that group. And as they ran along, the smugglers were pushing them, and finally they collapsed on the Lithuanian side. And the father that was holding the sack that had the baby opened it up, and the baby was gone. Somehow, running through the night, the baby had fallen out. Rav David Lifshitz Zatzal was one of the lucky ones who also escaped in a similar type of way. But Rav David didn't want to leave his family in Suvalk. I'm reading from the Yated Ne'eman's summary of Rav David Lifshitz's life. Yeshivas Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan also has some of this, but there's a much more extensive write-up in the Yated Ne'eman. And as the Nazis had begun to occupy, Rav David refused to leave his community, but he did send his wife, his widowed mother-in-law, and his 2 children, a 5-year-old girl and a baby, across the border along with a group of other Jewish refugees. Unfortunately, at this point, tragedy struck the family. During the clandestine border crossing, the baby began to cry, and the border guards, the Lithuanian border guards, opened fire. Rav David's 5-month-old daughter was tragically killed by the gunfire, and his wife and mother-in-law were captured by the Lithuanian police and returned to the Germans. Rav David's older daughter, how old was she? She was 5 years old. Rav David's older daughter was separated from her mother and somehow ended up in Kalvaria, a Lithuanian city that was home to 1,000 Jews. Ultimately then, Rav David tried to escape on his own and was successful, and somehow they found that 5-year-old daughter. I'm not sure which one. We know many of Rav David's son-in-laws were all famous Talmidei Chacham. I'm not sure which one that is. But at the end of but during this process of running away, ultimately their 5-month-old daughter was killed as well. In Toichal Nonoshim Piryam Alei Tipuchim Alei. Tivash Anorim Shimrachmani Yislodim Hamidudim Tfuchim Alei. To Goizna Pasrasham Visik Sharna Lususim Porchim Alei. To Bak Lashon Yoinek Lechech Bitsimon Sechichim Alei. Toyemena Zoi Lumazoi Bo Univashel Spinenu Tzorchim Alei. Tivana Zoi Lazoi Tnivinech Luchavui Minutach Nisachim Alei. Im Tizmen of the Saravois Albodim Bimorois Vishichim Alei. Im Tichuyavna Ponois Ochekim Osom Mispachim Alei. Tatoisna Ruchois Oilim Pirchoi Voiski Yotif Uchim Alei. Tiakirna Bishikul Rechem Vitzimuk Shadayim Veim Albonim Shichim Alei. Tilat Rucham Minim Ruchum Nesafuk Alei. Tilat Namiyalef Neyaviyasa. Terafna al dam noki shmoini melef koinim mishuchim alaleili. Tipachnu nefashos medukarim meiriat tenuvois sichim alaleili. Tzavarnu alev nachas tishal kabim moichilot imenochim alaleili. Tukanu shloish meoisin kimal shloicho achas mesuchim alaleili. Terei no rakois vanu gois kivulois al yad ratochim alaleili. Tishkamno bein shifotayim benois nedivim meshubachim alim tisalafno absolois valuchim mitzim oin svichim alalei. Mashikra moidiyim ve'es asher asu loy moidiyim toichal anoshim piryon mashmiyim yoreg b'mikdash Adonai koyin v'novi loy mashmiyim. Kinu Yud Ches and Yud Tes go together. Rav Soloveitchik pointed out something that's so fundamental that unfortunately the art scroll missed, and that is Kinu Yud Ches is all about questioning HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and Kinu Yud Tes is then Siduk Hadin. And what Rav Soloveitchik pointed out is that there are 11 questions in Kinu Yud Ches. Vilama, 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 11. And in Kinu Yud Tes, there are 11 responses of L'cha Hashem Atzdaka V'lanu Boshes Haponim. B'diuk. So these two Kinnos clearly were written together with a response. Lama, 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 with the response of L'cha Hashem Atzdaka V'lanu Boshes Haponim. So of course, L'cha Hashem Atzdaka is Achares Hachet, is recognizing that the source of it is not someone else's chisronos, but rather the source of it are our chaton. And of course, Tisha B'Av is a Tainus Sibur. The Rambam describes in Hilchos Tainus that the avoda of the Tanesim is a time of tshuva. Now it's interesting, the Rambam writes in the Pirkei HaMitzvahs, Mitzvahs aseh achas v'hilis anos v'lizok lefnei Hashem. Every Tainus is a kiyum of a mitzvah of lisanos v'lizok lifnei Hashem. Now the Meiser Rokeach asks the following question. He says, how could there be a mitzvah d'oraisa of inui if we know that there's only d'oraisa, the only fast that's a d'oraisa is Yom HaKippurim? So how is it that we count lisanos as being a mitzvah minat Torah when there is a tzara? We say lizok lifnei Hashem. I know that there's a mitzvah lizok lifnei Hashem, but lisanos, l'chura, the Rambam is describing not only Yom HaKippurim, but there's no makar outside of Yom HaKippurim for the din d'oraisa. That's what the Meiser Rokeach asks, and he suggests that the answer is that the Rambam is describing that the tainus itself is not a Meiser mitzvah, but rather is the derech for tshuva. In other words, Rabbosai, what we're doing over here now is we are fasting in order to direct our focus towards tshuva. And that is clearly a mitzvah d'oraisa. In other words, the Einachanami, the Torah doesn't prescribe inui on the fast days for tshuva, but at the same time, there clearly is a mitzvah lizok lifnei Hashem when there is a tzara, and the Rambam describes that the Tanesim are dedicated for that, for us to do that. The Rambam writes, "V'davar zeh midarkei hatshuva shebizman shetavo tzara v'yizaku alav v'yoriu yedu hakol shebeglal maseim haroim hura lahen." That it's an opportunity during the Tanesim for us to turn to HaKadosh Baruch Hu midarkei hatshuva. And therefore, it's not enough for us to tell stories that cause us to cry. As we start off with Rabbi Yonis and Eibeshitz, that is just a derech to inspire us to improve ourselves to be better Ovdei Hashem. And therefore, today, we need to set aside time for tshuva. We need to set aside time for tshuva. You know, Rabbi Aryeh Feldstein asked me what I think about the Tisha B'Av films. So my response to him is, we're a dor chalash. We're a weak dor, and we need them. Some of them are better than others. And it's a tragedy that even Tisha B'Av is turned into a business. What can we do? We have to take the good from the, we have to find the good. We have to find the kernel of good. And if it helps people, it helps people. It helps people get into the mindset of Tisha B'Av, v'chulei, v'chulei. Not everybody could sit through a rough babbling for 5 hours on Kinnos. That's, you know, you have to be really strange and very, very patient to be able to do that. For the Amonam, it's understandable. It's understandable. But Meidach Yisai, there's one thing I'm very scared about. And that is, a person could fool themselves that they are going to be stimulated in the most positive sense of the word with Tisha B'Av material, but they're going to be looking at a screen most of the day, and then eventually we all need a nap, and so on. And the ikr of the Tanesim is not only to awaken ourselves with the tragedies of Klal Yisrael, but is also to do an active tshuva. So it's quite a struggle to combat against Jewish Hollywood. That's not pashut. That's not pashut. So Lanias Daiti, we have in our base medrash before Ne'ilah, we have 2 minutes of Cheshbon HaNefesh. So I'd like to add this Tisha B'Av now as the films become more and more and more popular. I'm scared that we're going to go through the day without spending some time. And this time, instead of calling it Cheshbon HaNefesh, I asked the Chevra that we have 2 minutes of quiet where we sit and we make a Cheshbon HaNefesh and take a small Kabbalah on ourselves that we take away from this Tisha B'Av in order to make ourselves better people, to be able to be Zocha B'siyata D'Shmaya to the Binyan Hashlema. So let's do that moment of quiet right now for 2 minutes, just to think of maybe a Kabbalah that we could take on ourselves. I want to make one more point about the Rambam's Lashon of Achzorius. HaKadosh Baruch Hu be mezakas to be able to fulfill our Kabbalahs. The Rambam describes that if a person sees a tzara and he ignores it and doesn't work on himself, it doesn't internalize that there needs to be a change internally, the Rambam describes the individual as being an achsar. I think that applies particularly for those of us in the shul, for those of us who came to Eretz Yisrael, or for many different reasons, haven't served as soldiers. I think if we don't catch ourselves, then chas v'chalila we could be nichshal in that achzarius. Rabbi Yoni Belsberg, while he was serving, while he was fighting, while he was in a state of sakanas nefashos, had 4 of his friends die, were killed. Defending Am Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael. We could think about the loss in the context of all of Klal Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael. But then even also within our own base medrash. Just because we don't, for whatever reason, and for each one of us there are different reasons, we haven't gone through the same experiences as Rabbi Yoni, if we don't grab ourselves and mention the names Mordechai Amuyal, Shuvi ben Natan, Shmuel Harari, and Rabbi Yoni's childhood friend. They went to grade school together, they went to high school together, they went to yeshiva together. Aviad Naiman, whose muchus was one that was a tremendous Baal Chesed. Ben Chas v'Chalila, we could be nichshal in achzarias. Now, there are very different viewpoints in our shul, and I have tremendous pride in that. And I have pride in all the shitos. Some of them I agree with and some I disagree with. There are some who hold that the army is absolutely usher for reasons of ruchnios. Bili shum pshara. There are some who differentiate between younger unmarried men to older and married men. There's some who believe that we should look for a Haredi solution for everybody. And there's some here who hold that everybody is chayiv to serve. And I mean it when I say that Baruch Hashem, I'm proud that they're every single one of those positions in the space medrash. But at the end of the day, whatever your shita from your rabbeim is, there's absolutely no excuse and no escaping of achzarios. That means no matter what your shita is, Lanias Daiti, we have to show a real deep, empathetic concern for every single person in Klal Yisrael. Let's go to Yudches and Yutes. Vato amarta heitiv heitiv imoch v'niflinu ani v'amoch. Lama b'nei v'liyah chilu shemach v'loi shafachta aleim zamoch. Togid alta v'remamta bonim lohanei kasha yisrael meines hayonei. V'lama doidonim dotsu lizhanei. Vayegu roisav l'chanei ata hinakta devash misela. Natoitzi noizlim misela. V'lama shoifteim nishmetu videi sela. V'oleim nupotzu el hasola. Atozanachto vatimas kol goy. L'kachas goy mikerev goy. V'lomachosh v'olo el artzi goy. V'amluchu v'nachidei mi goy. Atoti teisa shishim u'shmoinim. Lovi goy shomer emunim. V'loma yozmu moyavim v'amoinim. Lamzu bakruvim moinim. Atoki vanto lo sheves hoidecho. Harze konso yimincho v'yodecho. Lama lo achar heishavto yimin yodecha. Vatinabel kisei chevoidecha. Atamaroim lo elam Adonai v'rishon. Kananta maroim me rishon. V'lama ni eitz rasha b'feveloshan. Ad kinogat sar b'ishon. Atosasta l'toiv oleimoi. V'siachta v'eimoi v'sito eimoi. V'lama ritz chereif amar Eloheimoi. Asher yochal chelev zivacheimoi. Tofay rarta v'azcha yom. Atosech b'dosayim yom. V'lama tzlalta ad nefei Ayigdal shivri kayom. Atakadosh yoishev tilois kedoshim. B'kerev yeshishim ha-mikudoshim. V'lama rakshu goyim am-kedeshim. Veishimu beis kodesh ha-kadoshim. Atoshma Eloheinu ki oyinu cherpo. V'sukascha beish nisrafa. V'lama siva nachlas chupa. Tatzmiach trufa v'aleinu choifa. V'ata tzadik al-kol ha'bavot. V'lama ne'ina v'lanu adima. Ki chol zois po asnu b'choiva l'cho Adonai yatztaka boises asher efleisim oz v'adot avon boises haponim v'chin asher nitzrafnu voisonot yavto cho Adonai yatztaka b'goy mikerev goy l'kachas b'masois v'onu boises haponim b'doifi asher nimtzavonu k'maseihem asois cho Adonai yatztaka V'holchu Elohim liftois loyla lanu boises haponim v'yamru al yom v'yamsuf goy b'loyav b'fasham Adonai yatztaka b'zeicher v'atoim eidai v'ani Elohim v'lanu boishes haponim b'chorfeinu Adonai b'sinkum asei lanu Elohim Chad no yatztok betamshi tamtonu katzavachis bidvash v'no b'shtamay b'yemikrav l'fanav soiles v'shem v'dvash. Chad no yatztok b'chilkumon uve'er v'amud ono v'lon b'shes upon b'lechem hakloikel avlisenu b'leihem birognon Chad no yatztok b'midbar loichasarnu davar v'lon b'shes upon b'niyatzais lavan v'chatzeres v'dizav kim dubar. Chad no yatztok b'sichon v'oigluchom amlachais kinov v'lon b'shes upon v'achon Asher ma'al b'cheirim b'limitzoy ma'an. Chadinu etzedakah b'foyal asher pa'alta b'abosor moishiyim. L'b'shpanim b'tzel micha kivoy enachnu poishim. Chadinu etzedakah b'kima shiloy v'noy v'givonim v'esav. L'b'shpanim b'resh ashnim tzavanu shechar v'uvam anu nichlam. Chadinu etzedakah b'shnei churbanos shechar v'b'vitzeinu v'anachnu kayomim. Lanu boishes haponim b'shuveinu eilecha b'chol leiv shetoshu v'li b'rachamim. V'cho Adonai yatzedakah b'shamei oishana shoisa sinak v'usha milihishama v'lanu boishes haponim kisavayish chamudais hatei Eloi hai oznecha u'shema. I can't say that I have a Masorah about what to say about every kinna, but there is one kinna that we do have a little bit of a Masorah, and that is on Kinna Chaf Aleph. Every year in Camp Aguda, Rav Belsky Zatzal would talk about one theme when he spoke about Arzei Alvanan Hadirei HaTorah. Of course, Kinna Chaf Aleph describes Asarei Harugei Malchus, differences between its description that we have on Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av. Rav Belsky did not talk too much about the detail of this kinna, about the great Tanoim who were killed in B'Shas Kiddush Hashem. I'll just add one thing before I begin what Rav Belsky wanted us to talk about, and that is it's absolutely striking to think about Rabbi Akiva passing on his Masorah to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Rabbi Akiva, one of the Asarei Harugei Malchus. The tkufa in which Rabbi Akiva lived, the darkness of losing his 24,000 Talmidim, yet starting all over again, and the persecutions that he overcame, and the Torah's Hanistar that emerged from it. I don't think it's a coincidence that the Torah's Hanistar, the world of Kabbalah, is revealed from the Mesira of Rabbi Akiva to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, one of his 5 Talmidim. And it would seem to me that we're not only mentioning the Arzei Halavanan Hadirei HaTorah to emphasize the suffering, but it's also the triumph of the Masorah. The triumph of the Masorah from Rabbi Akiva's apparent failures, his first set of Talmidim, the absolute darkness of that time, which leads to the writing of Torah Shebaal Peh. All of that is being commemorated when we say Arzei Alvanan. What Rav Belsky Zatzal spoke about is heroes. Rav Belsky spoke about is that one of the most important variables in chinuch is who our children's heroes are. Rav Belsky stopped at the language of Arzei Halvanan, the cedars of Lebanon, strong, powerful. Strength and power. What are our children going to grow up with in terms of their perception of what qualifies as someone who is truly powerful? Ezehu Gibar. I mentioned that I shudder to think how close I came when I was a child to the abyss in something as simple and as pariv as in my room, I had a picture of Bo Jackson hanging from the ceiling, one side of him playing for the Kansas City Royals, the other for the Los Angeles Raiders. And I was lucky that even though I was surrounded by a culture that these were the heroes, that somehow my father had imbued in me vayelchu shneim yachtav, that somehow our true heroes were somewhere else. But if you want to know who a person is, you have to ask who his heroes are. And we have a responsibility, particularly if HaKadosh Baruch Hu has given us the opportunity to be in Eretz Yisrael, to not be in Avira Kedusha, then we have a responsibility that our children, to raise our children, that their heroes are not professional athletes. We're far enough from American culture. You could argue that in America it's impossible. Yesh lodun, yesh lefalpel. There is room to argue that. I know a lot of kids who grew up in very, very frum homes in Lakewood, where it's almost impossible to. Still, it's impossible for them to protect themselves from the hero culture of athletics. But we're here, Rabbosai. We've been celebrating that we're here. So we're far enough from American culture that our kids don't have to grow up following the Yankees day in and day out. There's no problem. I'm not worried that if you go back to visit the grandparents every once in a while, emphasis on every once in a while, you go back to visit the grandparents every once in a while, you take them, and your grandparents take them to a Yankee game, great, that's fine. I'd recommend you take them to minor league games. It's better baseball, pure baseball. For those of us who really understand the game, I played shortstop once upon a time. For those of us who really, really understand the game, it's more real baseball. And it doesn't have the hero celebration. And Baruch Hashem, we're far enough from Israeli culture that we don't have to get caught into the soccer culture. So we're in a beautiful, beautiful place. Just hold it, Rabbosai. Sports are great. Sports are fantastic. Lania's Daiti, the Beis Yaakov system is wrong that they don't encourage the girl to take the exercise period seriously. Unfortunately, the health of Haredi women in Israel is worse than the average woman. It shouldn't be that way. It's wrong. And organized sports, I'm not talking about a really high-level little league. I'm talking about what Levi Friedman does, nothing more than that. But organized sports, and when I say organized, I mean what creates structure for children, what teaches them teamwork and so on and so forth. All of that has fantastic, fantastic value. And the kids, Lania's Daiti, in grades 1 through 8, L'chala Pachos in 1 through 8, should be encouraged to play ball. Not to be playing cops and cowboys and Indians in Chatzer. No, let them play ball. Let them play ball. Let the Rabbeim teach them how to play ball. That's great. But Adkan. Adkan because of 3 reasons. We don't need to have the struggles, we don't need to have our children have the struggles that we had. And 3 reasons. There are 3 dangers. I grew up with the slogan, I want to be like Mike. Why do our children have to grow up with such a sheker? There's nothing about being Mike that is a significant spiritual accomplishment, or for that matter, a human accomplishment. Are the things that we could learn from his competitive nature, his desire to win, not to give up? Absolutely. But the notion of I want to be like Mike, which permeates Western culture, that's something that we should have nothing to do with. Number 2 is there's no question that it's a distraction in our Avodas Hashem. Sports are great, it's healthy, but following teams in what is almost impossible for it not to become an obsessive way, is something that we've come to a place, we've been zocha to avira of kedusha. There's something about it, the avira kedusha, that makes that type of life that maybe you and I were familiar with in chutz la'aretz, it makes it a distraction. And finally, and this might be even the biggest one, the moment in which a child has the access in Ramat Beit Shemesh to truly follow sports is a moment in which we're probably giving them too much access to the broader, larger world that will prevent them from being steeped in Torah. 3 things. The dangers of I want to be like Mike, the distraction, that sports itself as a distraction. I'm not going to be so frum and use the word bittul Torah. I'm not going to talk about bittul Torah for the children. For you, it's bittul Torah. For the children, they don't need to hear that. And number 3, the third thing is that usually that access in Ramat Beit Shemesh represents a symptom of the fact that the child is being connected to a broader world that ultimately might prevent them from truly being steeped in Torah and Klal Yisrael. Now, I'm going to be blunt. Are there downsides to what I'm presenting? I'll be honest. Yes, there are downsides. There is something very, very meaningful to a parent and a child bonding together through sports. My brother, who's a massive Talmud Chacham, told me that at the end of Field of Dreams, he cried when Kevin Costner played ball with his father, because it reminded the emotions of the connection of playing ball with one's father. And it's true that there might be some level of bonding through sports that your children won't have if you don't follow sports together, don't follow a team together. Yes, I'm recognizing there is a risk, but let's grow up a little. In other words, Kevin Costner doesn't have to define our father-son relationship. There are other ways that a father-son relationship could be created. We don't have to be trapped into those previous conceptions that we had. So again, there are positive things that emerge from it. But we could still play ball with our children. It's true. The sports culture creates a certain depth of bond that you might not have. So maybe it'll be a Gemara. But it could be many other things. It could be Tiyulim in Artzeinu Akdosha. And yes, there's a challenge here. And that is, how are our children going to know English as well as we do? Rabbosai, you have to make some tough choices. It's true, the odds are that if your children are not going to watch movies and that your children are not going to be watching sports games, and if they don't happen to be a very studious kid who wants to read English, then the odds are their English is not going to be as good as you and I would like it to be. But there are choices that we have to make in life. And Tisha B'Av is a time for us to make some of those choices. At the end of the day, we have to decide what we're going to expose our children to, who their heroes are, who their heroes are going to be. I'm not concluding that your children's English has to be terrible. There are some fantastic schools out there, and there are fantastic chugim v'chulei, but there are some tough choices that we have to make. Either way, however you're going to make those tough choices, the one thing that I'm mevakesh is you really, really make a cheshbon hanefesh. What are we raising in terms of our children's heroes? That's something that we really, really, really have to think about. And we have to make an effort to expose our children to Gedolei Torah, that their heroes are Gedolei Torah. It takes time, forethought, but Ezras Hashem, I hope that we're going to be zocha to be able to do it. Arze alvonan adirei atoira, balitrisim b'mishno b'gemara. Baruch hayach amalel b'tara, dom nishbach v'narsa v'gvura. Hinam G'day she'arugei malchus asara, v'aleile ani voichiyo. Veini nigra, zois b'zachri ezak b'marach, and that's Yisrael. Klei HaKodesh nezer v'atara, Torah lev G'day she'meisa b'misa chamura. Yadu garam b'rishon lachere b'rura, kinfol garal ha'rebishon pashat salrei v'achon nikinim zera g'zeira. Ergo b'nefesh netzura mizera in shal b'vakashol v'koisal ben ha'gvira. Natal roisha in nisana yarku v'isa minayra ha'toira. Sameina v'aleina v'ufi v'alpi b'avo gemura. Anavamar pe hamiskader b'atoira. Kisaim niknisa la misa mishuna v'chamura. Tiva lavshi desroisha b'saras tira. Kiyam boira yamru l'nafshech shechi v'navoira. Rosha poishet eis igil makoim tfilin mitzvahs parot. Tzak tzakov is da zoi lo ve'eretz is poirora. Ne'acharov eviu es Rebbe Akiva. Oiker horim v'toichanan zoi b'zoi b'svara. V'sarku es b'sarai b'masreik shal barzel ishtabara. Yotzesa nishma zoi be'echad v'askol omra. Ashrecha Rebbe Akiva gufach tor b'chol minei Torah. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ben bavar Rabbi Yehuda acharav eviu b'shivron leiv azara nerag ben 70 shana bidei harura. Beginning ben Trandin acharav makil kilois b'tzion shara yoshev daresh v'sefer Torah imoi. V'kifu b'chavleis maras arit tzisu v'en l'uchrachu b'sefer Torah skvugin shotzim. Acharav Rabbi Chutz bis b'yoyim evro ifat poireyach nisraf navel b'kamdurat. Koina v'chaina isifu b'nei avla nois b'gara b'skilas reifa hereg v'chenek miyuchalish hara Sers ben yoichlu hara Yosef izura Azei atnufa v'shoikat trumat arfu arye v'agfira Yitiv Adonai v'lo Yosef oid liyasra Ametz birkayim koish lois chelek Yaakov Moshiach be'esara L'tzedek yim loich melech yoimar shamu yimei evleich V'oiroi nisa v'neilech Kinachaf Beis Hachirishu moves over. It's written by Rameir B'Yechiel, but it moves over from the Churban Beis Hamikdash. The other Kinno also was written by Rameir Ben Yechiel, but here he moves over from the Churban Beis Hamikdash and the Asarei Rugei Malchus to commemorating the massacres in the Crusades. Rav Soloveitchik pointed out that it's not a coincidence that Kinno Chaf Beis appears after Kinno Chaf Aleph, and on page 430, 431, Rav Soloveitchik has a couple of very, very insightful points that I'd like to read inside. In a sense, this kinno is a continuation of the kinno of Arzei Alvanan. In both kinnos, the deaths that are described represent a double catastrophe. Thousands of Jews were killed during the Crusades, but the tragedy was not just the murder of 10 people, during Roman times, the tragedy was also the fact that the greatest scholars of the Jewish people were killed. In this kinna, the mourning that is expressed is not just for the inhuman act of massacre, but rather the principal emphasis is on the destruction of the Torah centers in Germany. In other words, what Rav Soloveitchik is describing is that the progression of the kinna of Arze Alvanon to Hecharishu Mimenu Va'adabera that commemorates the destruction of the Crusades centers around the destruction of Torah. Of course, the human tragedy and human suffering is central as well, but the emphasis over here is the destruction of the Torah centers. That's point number one. Our pulse is HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Torah. The future of Klal Yisrael revolves around HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Torah. Then Rav Soloveitchik on page 431 makes a very, very important historical point, which I don't know is emphasized enough. The historical background is important. The center of Torah in Europe and the schools of the Balei Tosfos began in Germany, not in France. Most of us, when we think about the Rishonim, we think about the Rishonim from Rashi, the Balei Tosfos in France. But the Torah scholars in Germany were more numerous than the Tosafos in France. We hardly know of many of them. All of the Torah scholars of Germany perished, and many of their writings were destroyed. In other words, what we're describing here in Kinnos Chaf Beis is the description, particularly of the Torah centers in Germany. Rav Soloveitchik goes on and he says, it is a miracle, and that's what we're thinking about also when we describe the discussion of German Jewry and the Torah centers in Germany. It is a miracle that the Torah Shebaal Peh continued in spite of the fact that the center of the time was Germany. Torah Shebaal Peh was able to survive because by then the centers of Torah had already begun to be established in France. Rabbeinu Tam, the Ri, were French scholars, not German. All due to Rashi, who turned France into a center of Torah. Rashi, when he was younger, Rashi went from France to Germany to learn by his Rabbeim. Rashi learned by Rabbi Yaakov ben Yakar. Rashi learned by Rabbi Yitzchak ben Elazar Halevi. He then returned to France with the Torah of Germany immediately prior to the destruction of the center of scholarship. Just to appreciate, if we haven't appreciated Rashi enough when we're stuck on a line, when we read Gemara, Rashi going to learn in Germany, bringing back the Torah of Germany to France, creates the survival of Klal Yisrael's Masorah. In time, Rav Soloveitchik continues, France became the center of Jewish wisdom. Instead of traveling from France to Germany as Rashi did, the generation after Rashi traveled to France to study at the academies of Rabbeinu Tam and Rabbi Yechiel of Paris. Rav Soloveitchik here goes so far to say something that I wouldn't have expected him to say. Our Torah Shebaal Peh is based on Rashi and Tosfos. If Jewish history had not included Maimonides, everybody knows that the Rambam was maybe the most important figure for Rav Soloveitchik. Listen to this. If Jewish history had not included Maimonides, the Jewish world would have missed a great deal. Maimonides enriched our thinking and worldview tremendously, but the Torah Shebaal Peh would have survived without him. However, without Rashi and Tosfos, there would not have been any Masorah, any chain of tradition. We could not teach Torah Shebaal Peh properly today. So Kinnos Chaf Beis describes that churban of the Torah centers in Germany, but also celebrates the fact that the Shalshelas HaMasorah, the Netzach Yisrael Lo Yishaker, that Klal Yisrael continues on through Rashi v'Chaverov that moved back to France and created the Daf Gemara as we know it today. Harishu mimenu v'adabeirov yavor olaymo. Kayolei defer shafer shoymo mispad maresei v'koinimo. Tivrei shagosai yitchu kayamo. Siftu ala dosai asher nitnu l'shamo. איך שבס מסויס ורבוסים כל קופונים פרור וכל רויש קרחה וכל זקן גדועה ועל כל לב הנחה מעוז נסיירר גוי עדוי רישוחה. Sali Slabi Rages. Our boy Sabichi Ularim Tzivcha Helu Shamayim Zaki Adama. Erelim Tzuvitzaku Maras Foitam Rur Heogdu Bechabura Kol Kacholot Sorakim Afkira. Ish Esachi B'Chizku Be'ezra Lidavek Yurta Likroy Alavo Lavoy Dazaro. Loichasu Gever Gvra Ponim Sfiras Tifara Avolas Rugvura Yisrael Alam Rosh Likroy. Lo izachinu legadolchem latoiro nagrivchem kol lavaktor v'miskeim lochem lo iratzfuna mein kol valuma. Oz eskimu gdolim uktanim lekadol ba'avodin shoichem oinim muskenim deshem v'ranim heim oyut pilani toinim. V'vois asher oyu rachmanim nefchu lachzor kayenim. Who nishchat b'chalafois v'sakinim v'achrum alei selo emunim imlachu afar kisaninim v'akalos v'shoishonim u'lafois b'zrois chasonim v'nutachois b'cher v'chidonim zichru zois kahal adas nevoinim v'altechshu me'arbois kinim v'spidu al chasidim v'agunim Toira chigrisak v'spal shiva forim evel yochid asiloch Mispei tamrurim al toif sei mishoitayich ufor sei machmoirim. Mi katsen was mi sateis parim mi forei kam yes mi says. Mi sadei mama kayach v'chatu ikorim milcham v'chantem. B'mnuchoi shalom nachu yesharim. Oy vavoy shoit v'shevel enoisarim. Erev oimrim mi itein tzifarin voikem etzapim mi gala oimrim. Kanei l'say rasecha asher s'rafua zarim. Im shovei fesha leunim umrurim richamoy sam bal tacharimo karno magbiya v'horimo. Move on to Kinnos Chafei, that now speaks about the Crusades that moved on, starting in Germany, then ultimately moved on in France. ArtScroll does a very, very good job on pages 270, 271, and 272, describing the different parts of the First Crusade, beginning in 1096. And on bottom of 272, they describe a tragedy that unfortunately has repeated itself a few times in Jewish history. I'm reading from the ArtScroll on the bottom. Early in the year 1096, the French communities threatened with extinction if they did not submit to baptism, called upon the great Jewish communities on the Rhine to ordain a day of fast and prayer. The Jews on the Rhine compiled and prayed fervently for the welfare of their French brethren. However, here's the punchline. However, they themselves felt perfectly secure, enjoying as they did the special favor of the emperor and the local nobility. But all too soon, the frenzied mobs of crusaders poured in, and early in the spring, in the weeks between Pesach and Shavuos, violence broke out and atrocities escalated. The three Jewish communities of Vermais, of Speer, Mainz felt the main brunt of the carnage, and hence this Kinnos includes their communities as well. When I read these lines about the Jews in Vermais and the Jews in Mainz, who davened for their fellow brethren in France, but they felt protected. A few things go through my mind. First of all, my father, Olav Shalom's description of what the world was like in 1944, late 1943, 1944. 1943, 1944, the extermination camps in Poland are in full swing, and the 3 million Jews of Poland are almost through 90% of them being exterminated. My great-grandparents, many people here, great-grandparents, most of my mother and father's cousins, aunts and uncles, Hashem Yikom Domo. At that time in Hungary, the Jews were living regular lives. Talk about Hester Panim. Jews were living regular lives in Hungary at that time. They were davening for their fellow brethren in Poland and Lithuania. And the Russians are now pushing Nazis back. The Battle of Stalingrad is happening. The Nazis are slowly being pushed back. And the Jews in Hungary are optimistic. And the Nazis managed in 1944, I'm not a historian, I don't have all the details, but the details are less important with the Yesod. In 1944, the Nazis managed, as they were really essentially losing the war, the Nazis managed to kill 1 million Hungarian Yidden, Achenu Bungaria. So aside from 1933 to 1939, where the writing was on the wall in Germany, the Nazis had already exterminated most of Polish Jewry at that time. And yet the Yidden in Hungary, for some crazy reason, felt relatively safe. They were worried, a little worried. And the lesson is a very, very simple human lesson, not even a lesson of Avodas Hashem, just a lesson of Jewish history and the nature of humanity, is that when our enemies say they're going to do something, they're going to do everything they can to do it. And we've learned it time and time and time again. And that's why I referred to Simchas Torah Tafshin Pei Gimel as Hester Panim. They were rioting on the border the summer before. But there's something about our nature, Am Kshei Oref, there's something about our nature, our optimistic nature, maybe that's part of our ability to survive, but also it becomes a very, very, a tremendous Achilles heel for us. And we forget this at our peril. I don't know what this means, Lamaisa, but it's something that needs to be called out. It's something we need to think about. And it's something we need to process, that we've made this mistake time and time and time again. Yishishei kol lai vatem anu avoy oy valalai v'chein b'choy becherav v'herev al beis Yisrael v'alam Adonai ki naflu b'chorev v'domai atid me'aini ve'el choli sidei boichim v'avake ini morei leivov hanivoichim al b'sulois hayafois v'lodim arakim v'sifrehem nichrochim v'lotevech nimshochim Admu etzem mipnimim sapirim v'noifechim k'moi titchutzois nidashim v'nishlachim suru tamei karu lamoi mili karei v'abeisov alam Adonai ki naflu b'charev v'seirei deini dima v'lilav anuda v'vchiv lach garsak v'ekra lahaspida mipazi karav ezov chamuda ay 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 Pnima kvuda kavoid kol kleichem da Risia Karua Shpula V'Galmuda HaTorah VaHamikra VaMishnah VaAgada Anu V'Koinenu Zois LaHakida Eisayra Talmid HaValonda Haloi HaMokoim Ein Yoshev Chorev Al Beis Yisrael VaAmandinoi Kinoflu B'Chorev Abapais Lumayim Demala Hagira Lakini Mare Layaruge Ashpira Shivishwan Yoy Margo Ukra Margo Nechlefu Lahavira Nergu Bachure Chemed Vishishe Hadora Neswiyacha Nafsha Mishlimu B'Moira Al Yichud Shem Am Yuchad Yichadu Shem B'Kvura Gibare Choyach Sedvarai Limahara V'Choyanai Ulamay Nivku Kolem Asora Uvemar Yigoiniva Tzbi Yelel Achbira Kilois HaKadosh Hariga Samayoim B'Zachra Kalver Marzia B'Chunu V'Chura Goine Eretz Nikiyei Tahara Pamayim Kidshu Shem HaMiyuchad B'Moira Be'esrim Ushloisha B'Chodesh Ziv Tarvachashli B'Kriyas Halel L'Shoyrir Shim Navsham B'Avakshu Oim Aleim B'Chni Yelel L'Chashu Like Kesar Shabbat Tirikam L'Kesar Terisham Kenes Shivra בחודש השלישי, בחודש השלישי נוסף לדלה מירה. מתן תורה סיברתי לסשר. שימו על לבבכם מספד מר לקושרה, כי שכולה רגסו כשריפס בייס אלוהינו עולם ואבירה, וכי אין לא יוסיף מויד שבע וסבירה, אין להקדים זלעשי לאחרון. ועל אלה אני ויחיה וליבי נויהם נהימויס, וכל מקנויס ולחכמויס. אלי ואל יא כולם הוימויס, יש מחלב למחלבי לדמויס, בחוץ לשקל דם מחדרמי מויס, חלי חרב מיתולים הרומי והרומויס, ובוסך וסלחויס. מסתאים בו מויניים ומרבים כלים מויס. יוח מיכלס. אין יורדמיים, כי נפח לב אל משורר. חיימה בי יוצא ושר מסקורר, אכלי המוני עצמוש. שיבר עצמו יסי זורר מפורר, סילו כל אבירי הטבור והשורר. כן אמרתי שומני אמורר, בבחי דמוסי עליכי לצורף. Al Beis Yisrael Val Amadoinoi Ki Naflu Bechorev. The hour is late. We'll move on to Kinnos Lamed Aleph. Of course, there is a particular nusach or liturgy for B'tzeisim Mitzrayim, B'tzeisim Yerushalayim. The question begs itself, what is the parallel? Why do we emphasize the parallel B'tzeisim Mitzrayim to B'tzeisim Yerushalayim? Is it just a play on opposites, or there is a thematic idea that we're supposed to process? So in the past we've given different pshatim. I'd like to suggest a new pshat today. The Ramban in Sefer Boy, of course, writes that Yitzias Mitzrayim is the source of all emunah for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. God proved his existence through Yitzias Mitzrayim. He chose Am Yisrael, and that chosenness will never change, and that God's existence does not need to be proven over and over again, the Ramban describes. That's B'tzeisim Mitzrayim, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu proved his existence to us. But maybe just like HaKadosh Baruch Hu proved his existence to us forever through going out of Mitzrayim, we have a responsibility to remember HaKadosh Baruch Hu when we leave Yerushalayim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu chooses us and we have the opportunity to choose him when we are expelled from Yerushalayim, or chas v'chilui, we can make the mistake and reject him. Just like HaKadosh Baruch Hu was revealed to us and we accepted him when we left Mitzrayim, so too, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we reveal him and we choose him when we leave Yerushalayim, when we mourn. We could get stuck in the stories, or we could come close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Reb Sruli Bornstein said a very, very special mashal. He said, imagine there is a very, very wealthy, relatively young man. He has a beautiful home in his city. He has a beautiful summer home. He has a beautiful home in Europe. And of course, he has a beautiful apartment in Israel. That's nowadays that's the bucket list, right? And he goes on beautiful vacations. And then you find out that this guy has a father who's homeless. His father sleeps on a park bench and goes through the garbage to get his food. What an oisvarf. What an oisvarf. Rabbosai, it's a little bit us. Baruch Hashem, each one of us have a very nice apartment, exactly what we need. Kanireh, we don't need 3-4 apartments. We have what we need. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't have a home. Our Father doesn't have a home. And how much do we think about that? How much time do we put in to fixing our own home? And how much time have we put in to thinking about HaKadosh Baruch Hu's home? B'tzeisi Mirushalayim, just like I recalled HaKadosh Baruch Hu when he took me out of Mitzrayim, so too, B'tzeisi Mirushalayim, I don't only focus on my personal pain of Golus, and you and I have some pain of Golus. There are a lot of questions that we had this morning that we don't have answers to. But how much have we thought about that the Tata doesn't have a home? How much have we thought about the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has built a beautiful world, and how much of humanity really, really connects to the entire mission that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has created in the world? The Gdolei Machshava speak about that. That's what tefillah is not supposed to be about my own personal needs. It's supposed to be thinking about Kvod Shemayim. It's a higher madrega. It's not so easy to tap into. But this mashal is very, very helpful, at least for Tisha B'Av. And so next time, when we're thinking about our apartment, next time we should chap ourselves when it's not Tisha B'Av. And say, what are we doing to build the Beis HaMikdash? What Kabbalah did I make on Tisha B'Av? Now, I'm moda that there is a challenge here. And the challenge lies in another beautiful mashal that we've mentioned in the past from the Dubner Magid Zechusa Yoden Aleinu. Dubner Magid describes that there's a couple who haven't had children for a very, very, very long time. And finally, the woman becomes pregnant, a high-risk pregnancy, and then childbirth begins after 9 months, and the doctor comes, and the doctor says the situation is terrible. And either if I don't, the only way the mother is going to survive is if I abort the child. And the mother turns to the doctor and she says, I've been living this entire moment for my entire life to be able to be zocha to bring a child into the world. And if this is our choice, let the child be born. It has a whole life. It's a boy. He has a whole life ahead of him. And it's time for me to go. And the child is born. Child grows up. And every day on 1 year, the father goes to the Beis HaKvaros to visit his wife And as a child gets older, he brings his son along to come along with him. But the child is distracted. And the father slowly tries to describe to his son all of what his mother had done so that he would come into the world. But the son turns to the father and says, but I never met my mother. You knew my mother, but I never knew my mother. The Dubner Maggid defends Klal Yisrael, that sometimes Klal Yisrael forgets what it is to have the Beis HaMikdash because we've already forgotten. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to us, why aren't you missing the Beis HaMikdash enough? And the Dubner Maggid says, Klal Yisrael says, we never really knew her. We don't remember her anymore. We've forgotten her. So on the one hand, the Tata is homeless. On the other hand, the son is not a full Eisvarf. We're not a full Eisvarf in the sense that we don't even know what it means for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to have a home. Both Mishalim are true. A dialectic. On the one hand, the Tata is in Galus. On the other hand, we don't know exactly what it means for the Tata to have a home. We have totally forgotten it. I'll just say two things. It's late. It's very late already. I'll just say two things. And that is, Rabbosai, we miss seeing HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The response to the son is, no, you can get to know your father. There is a certain chashchus that we have. There is a certain lack of clarity that we are missing. Once upon a time, we were able to go to the Beis HaMikdash in Yom HaKippurim, and we were able to see the red string turn to white. We were able to see HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the Nisan of the Beis HaMikdash. We don't have that, and we suffer because of it. There's a tremendous amount of confusion that we have. Once upon a time, we were able to see the Kohen Gadol B'avodaso. Once upon a time, we were able to go to Lishkas HaGazis, and the Chachamim would be able to come to a decision. It would be with the Melchamta Shel Torah, all the glory of Melchamta Shel Torah, and all the Pilpul, and all the Lamdas, and so on. We'll still have all of our Chaburas, and much more. But at the end of the day, then all of Klal Yisrael will have a uniformed Hanhaga. Klal Yisrael will have a clarity, and we suffer from that so much. So may we be zocha b'siyata d'shmaya b'tzeisi miMitzrayim when we saw HaKadosh Baruch Hu, also to remember HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'tzeisi miYerushalayim. Eish tu kabikir b'ba'aloi siyali bi b'tzeisi miMitzrayim kinem ha'yira l'manazkir b'tzeisi miYerushalayim Az Hashem Moshe shir lo yinasha b'tzeisi miMitzrayim ekon yiriyo v'naniya v'niya b'tzeisi miYerushalayim Beisi yiskanem v'shachan hanam b'tzeisi miMitzrayim V'chamasel shochno alai kanana b'tzeisi miYerushalayim Dunim shatafu v'aroishi tzafu b'tzeisi miYerushalayim D'gan shamayim u'mitzor yazuvu mayim b'tzeisi miMitzrayim lanogo umroim rimu mayim amorim b'tzeisi miYerushalayim Hashkem Sevivoy sarchoy rebitzeisi miMitzrayim Koirei elei velanaros bovel bitzeisi miYerushalayim Umarei kvoid Adonai ki eshoy cheles lefanoi bitzeisi miMitzrayim V'cherev letusha letevach netusha b'tzeisi miYerushalayim Zevach u'mincha v'shemen hamishcha b'tzeisi miMitzrayim Skulas elikucha kitzavoy letivcha b'tzeisi miYerushalayim Chagim v'Shabbos sois u'moivsim v'yoisois Tzeisi miMitzrayim Tanis v'yevel urdoi fahevel b'tzeisi mirushalayim. Toivu ay halim li'arba odigalim b'tzeisi mimitzrayim. V'yolei yishme'elu m'machanoi sareilim b'tzeisi mirushalayim. Yoivel u'shmita v'yeresh keita b'tzeisi Mitzrayim. Sos b'tzeisi mirushalayim. Kapoires v'aroin v'havnei sikaroin b'tzeisi mimitzrayim. V'yavnei hakala uchlei habala b'tzeisi mirushalayim. Levim v'aroinim v'shivim zekeinim b'tzeisi mimitzrayim. Noixim umoinim umoichrim v'koinim b'tzeisi mirushalayim. Moshe yireinu v'yaroin yancheinu b'tzeisi mimitzrayim. Nebuchadnezzar v'Daryanus Keisar b'tzeisi mirushalayim. Naroich milchama v'adoinoi shama b'tzeisi mimitzrayim. Rachak mimenu v'hinei einenu b'tzeisi mirushalayim. Sisrei feroiches v'sidrei mareches b'tzeisi mimitzrayim. Cheimoni teches v'olai soicheches b'tzeisi mirushalayim. Oilo uzvachim v'yishem nechoichim b'tzeisi mitzrayim. B'cherev midukarim b'nei tzion hayikarim b'tzeisi mirushalayim. Parei mikbo ois lechavoi mikbo ois b'tzeisi mimitzrayim. Shrikois usruois v'koidlois uzvois b'tzeisi mirushalayim. Tzitz hazov v'hamshel v'rab b'tzeisi mimitzrayim. Ushlach hanezer v'ofas ha'ezer b'tzeisi mirushalayim. Kedusha nevuach v'adadoinu nira b'tzeisi mimitzrayim. Nigala u'mayra v'ruach atuma b'tzeisi mirushalayim. Rihina v'yishua v'chatzois v'satrua b'tzeisi mimitzrayim. Zakas olo v'nakas cholo b'tzeisi mirushalayim. Shulchan u'mnoira v'chalil u'ktoira b'tzeisi mimitzrayim. Elel v'soeva u'fesel u'matzeva b'tzeisi mirushalayim. Toiros u'da u'chlei achemda b'tzeisi mimitzrayim. Sasain v'simcha v'nas yagoin v'anacha b'shuvim shalayim. The end of Kinnos have the Kinnos of Tzion. There are many of them, which of course we won't be able to say. But of course the emphasis of Tzion is to emphasize that we conclude the Avelus of Tisha B'Av by being shoef to the full beauty of Tzion. And it contextualizes what we're not only, as we spoke about, mourning the past, but we're looking the Siyata D'Shmaya to the future of the full beauty of Tzion. Lamid Vav. Tzion halosh tishali l'shlom asirayim. Dorsher shlemechim yesra dorayim. Miyam u'mizrach u'mitzafam v'seimon. Shloim rachoik v'koroi v'si mikol havarayich. Shloim asir tikvon. Ha'yisein dimov kitel charmon. So the ritual harayich. V'koisam v'sechan yisim. V'yisech aloim shivashu v'sechan yichinar l'shirayich. Libi leveisel v'lifnei el moed yemel machanayim v'chonigei toirayich. Sham hashchina shchuna lach v'yitzvech pasach l'mul sharei shachak sharayich. Uchvoid Adonai levad hayom mi'oirech v'intzar v'shemesh v'kol chavim mi'oirayich. Evchar l'nafshi l'ishtapech v'mkoim asher ruach l'im shefucha al b'chirayich. At peis melucha v'at kisech void el Veich Yoshua avodim alei chisois kivirayich mitneni mishoiteit. V'mkoim moisa sheniglu elim lechoizayich v'tzirayich. Mi yaselich nafayim v'archik nedoi. Doni levisrei levavi ben bisorayich. Epol api alei artseich. Vertzov v'nayich lemod v'achoinines aforayich. Afki bomdi alei kivrois avlisai. V'eshtamim alei chevroi mivchar kvorayich. Harovarim v'orahor asher shom shnei oirois kidolim moirayich u'moirayich chayei nishamois avir artseich marduror avkas aforech v'noifesuf norayich v'nafshi oloi choron v'yochef alei chorvoi shemamo asher hodiv hirayich v'mkoim harinich asher nignaz v'mkoim kruvayich sheshachnu chadrei chadorayich ogoiz v'ashlich pernes v'kov zmon Chilel baretz bavel es nizirayich eich yarev li yochol v'shasois peisach hazeh Kischavu aklovim eskefirayich oy eich mor yoim yimosoy kleinai boy der refi orvim pigrei v'sorayich kois ha'ignoinim la'at harpi me'at kifor maluchis olay v'navshim imroirayich eis eskero Allah eshtech amorich v'eskoro livov emtso eshimorayich Siyoin klilas yoifi ava v'chein arilim oy d'vachnak shun yach shoyz chavirayich Hey, mas mechin l'shav l'seich v'akoyvim al shoy m'moisayich u'voichim al shivorayich mibor shevi shoyafim negdich mishtachavim eish mimikoym aleinu ichach shorech edrei hamoynach asher golu nispasru mehar legif avloy shechugu gidei rayich masikim mishalayich misamsim lalois v'lechois b'sansinei simorayich shinoru fasrois hayarchuch b'kadvon mevom yadam hu'lesumayich v'rayich l'midam u'mishichach v'l'minach Niach v'shiret yishanel yaklov kalul kol mamlachoi soel milim. Chasnech lo elam ledor v'dor nizirayim. L'rois b'toy vas b'chirayich l'lois b'simchosech b'shuveich elei kadmus niurayich. The last two kinnos that we're going to say before Elei Tzion are the kinnos for the Kedoshim of the Shoah. There was a legendary Gaon, Rav Pinchas Hirschsprung, who is known for his beautiful countenance and his tremendous Gaonus of Torah. I did not know, as I mentioned to the Chevra during Raiva de Ravin, that Rav Hirschsprung, who had learned in Yeshivas Chachmei Lublin, escaped, as I alluded to previously, to Vilna, and then ultimately got a visa that brought him for a short time to Asia and then to Canada. He had written a personal diary. It's probably, Rav Hirschsprung was a Gaon Olam. I was unaware of his diary. The diary is called The Veil of Tears. And he describes his experiences at the outbreak of the war, living in a shtetl, going back home from Yeshivas Chachmei Lublin, where he by then was a boichen in the yeshiva. He was known as being a baki b'shas that was able to do the pin test. And he wrote a diary of his experiences. I want to read two things before we say the kinnos for the Kedoshim of the Shoah. One is his description of when he was taken early on because he was recognized as his father was a Rav. He was already recognized as a young Rav. He was chosen by the Nazis and sent to a concentration camp. And he was held responsible for all the behavior of the Jews in the camp because he was their rabbi. And he wrote in his diary the following thing. I was called into a commander's office and he informed me that because a large number of Jews had quote unquote broken the law, I had to assume responsibility for them. I was going to be punished with hard labor in a concentration camp. This is early on. This is 1940. He managed to make his way to Vilna still when Reb Chaim Gruzhensky was still alive, Reb Chaim Oizer was alive. So that means this story takes place in late 1939, 1940. 2 stormtroopers then drove me to a concentration camp not far from town. There I met many captured Polish soldiers. In the camp, people not only worked from time to time, but were just punished for no reason whatsoever. The treatment was unbearable, and the work I was forced to do was humanly impossible. I was making every effort to comply with the demands of the Nazi taskmasters, but still the work was overwhelming. Then one day, it was a 3rd week after my arrival in the camp, when the Nazis were busy torturing somebody whose screams were virtually driving me insane. I decided that I would leave the camp and run wherever I could. The idea that I could be shot for this did not frighten me at all. In other words, Rav Hirschsprung was in such torment that he preferred just to run, and if he got shot, life would be better just being end by being shot by a Nazi bullet than continue in the torment in that camp. On the contrary, by the way, there were some Gedolei Torah that told Rav Hirschsprung not to write this diary. I think this is one of the reasons. On the contrary, this thought impelled me to run away because I preferred being shot by a Nazi guard than, heaven forbid, having to have a thought to commit suicide. I left the camp and I set out to a road to Rimanov. And the next chapter begins in his diary, which was written in 1940. I managed to arrive safely to Rimanov. This happy Gaon V'Torah, the torture that he was under, and the desire to escape no matter what. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu made it that he survived. L'mala me'ateva. One more piece, and with this we'll say the Kinnos. On Yom Kippur 1940, the status in the shtetl was so awful that Rav Hirschsprung decided that it was Yom Kippur, that he was going to daven at home because it was too dangerous for him to go to the shul and daven with everybody else. And he had a friend, Mendel Schuss, who had just run away from a town called Prishemil, and he came into him on Yom Kippurim, right before Nila. Rav Hirschsprung described that during Ne'ilah he had a tremendous, during davening Yom Kippur he davened all alone, and he felt a tremendous strength of fresh belief and renewed courage. And he writes, my heart was filled with deep inner joy, peace, and calm, despite what was going on around me. And then his friend Mendel arrives. His despondency and the sadness in his eyes scared me. My tranquility vanished. I became anxious. Mendel told me that he had barely escaped with his life. In his town, he had said 600 Jews had just been slaughtered on Yom Kippur. And he began to recite the names of the people who he saw killed. I knew the 78-year-old Gaon Reb Hirsch Glazer. On the footnote, they described where he was the Av Bezdin, who knew the entire Mishnayos Baal Peh, Reb Zaydel, a grandson of the Belzer Rebbe, a son and a son-in-law of his, and so on. When I asked Mendel how it happened, can you imagine going into Ne'ilah like this? The Nazis ordered all the Jews to leave their house and assemble on the market square. Anyone found at home would be shot on the spot. The Nazis ordered that the houses be left unlocked. Over 600 Jews assembled. This all Rav Hirschsprung is writing in 1940, after Yom Kippur. The Nazis surrounded them with machine guns, but before the command was given to shoot, the 78-year-old Reb Hirsch Glazer, who was the Av Bezdin, shouted at the Gestapo heroes, quote-unquote heroes, you are not just murderers. You probably intend to shoot all 600 people at once. Do you really believe that these people deserve to die? I want to tell you that these people are all innocent. I, their leader, are to be blamed for educating them. You should shoot me and not the innocent Jews. The Gestapo man shouted back at the Gaon, because you educated them in such a fine manner, you will be rewarded by witnessing with your own eyes how your lambs are slaughtered, and you, their shepherd, will be slaughtered last. My friend Mendel continued. Immediately afterwards, the order was given to shoot. The assembled crowd was pelted by a hail of bullets. Their cries of Shema Yisrael rose to the heavens. Then it was the turn of the elderly Gaon. His stomach was slashed open, and his intestines removed with a spear. We'll read the Rebbe of Bobov's, Kinnos, and then Rav Schwab's. I don't have Rav Nebensal's in front of me right now, so I'll try to say it later. Zichruna v'kaininu kol Yisrael kol cham yishama b'rama kishmida Germania es amenu b'meizam hamilchama b'misois mishunot zachzariyos barav uvatzama al tishichu b'chol adoyros eidei sisku l'rois b'nechama Sakosam uvchiyoseihem tzfufim uskurim b'akroinim katzoin latevach yuvalu l'sreifa makiv shoinim Kol shavam yizacher tamid lifnei shoichem oinim v'karam shema Yisrael masru nafsham la'adoinei ho'adoinim Roshei yeshivois v'salmidoihem v'hamoinei amcha shama evidum b'inugim koshim v'arogim b'yad rama d'meilodim rakim soikim elecha min ha'adama Nikoim nikmas tavin of chim loise chaye kol neshama. Al sreifas al fei midrashois uvatei knisiyos revois sifrei Torah v'loim deha nikoinein b'shiyos. Shilchu v'eish mikdashei el hitzisu v'eineinu tzayfiyos. Yishalim ha'maviras ha'beira yodim b'agoyim olei gviyos. Zaku shamayim v'adama al fei ayarois b'tzarei sayro. Artzei sayro pavikilo sel noichlu v'kaimei mesayro. Tzadikim zkenim v'chasidim dveikei emunot Torah. Miyoim golinu me'artzenu lo yachazek ki lo yoim hara. Rachem al she'reseinu habetno mishamayim l'machnois ha'kedoshim pi aser ki yotzei Mitzrayim. Koimeim beis kodsheinu v'nachameinu b'chiflayim. Roimemenu v'avienu l'tzion. Yerushalayim hazoicher maskirov dor doruk doisho. Meis asher az becharton uzikar diran shel dar acharoin oyami hayavanu shetufei mabul dam shem hasru nafsham koshkreim ke abacha yifkideim eloyim b'artzoi zachayim v'adei zefram u'vracham suelov kapayim aha eishamayim hoyam meitam shiltei Yisrael idois ukilois arim uglibois chavurois moisadois kol mayadei elmitei balgei mayadei Al alfei alofim gufim nisrafim b'moyoi shachurban uzvois. Val sarei hatoiro machzikei mosoiro val pirchei akim ha'etzivi. Al chashim nirois u'moirim u'moirois tinoi kris beis rabban yakim. Al boinois boitchois v'sovim v'sofois. Al zarom v'tapom she'yavadu. Loi nefrot. As the mom de Roish Kisisa as Roish shall call Nidaf Lelimatrufi. Kolchilu Gnina Ugnicha Nehitzricha Mishtude La Koisaklam. Skurus the four benoit Chatzarades Nakan Oboin Lovim. Machanois haproim keiv unigoim ufachay nefashois agumois charofois utzchoy klimois v'agim tzehakois ayumois rovoin simoin shigo initzamoin v'eshloin erasholim b'lichayach onakas chalom mikol yochidum lo chalim lecham b'lishkoyach simrois hashom v'kitor mikim shoin tilei tilim atzamois v'gidim lechatrei haral kol shogois mikalen echnokim toichtei ha'im v'simon Sirchain gufais ugviois gufais klaude gufut orfeil kritzas at spoish oroshia prois Sesamim lo ilodam b'nei hagula hayariyam nivlaschas Fareya Freya Kedosam Trumois Tishnim Mizbeach Mi Malel Tsar Yisrael Asher Daitoi Mikev Nitrefes Usheris Haper Kimat Mizer Ve'ekoi Mosa Hayoim Nichfefes El Chaim mirachim ados chonachim ashalacham oy nitzefes. Or chodosh tazriach karnei hoy tatzmiyach. Ruach Elohim mirachefes. Elitzion ve'yorel k'moisha v'tzirel v'chesura gurasan ve'armon asher nutash v'yash matzoy toreo v'al miyas mefarfeya v'soif mikdash
Show